Humans, for thousands of years, have deliberately selected which plants and animals shall live. We're surrounded with farm and domestic animals, fruits, vegetables. Where did they come from? Were they once free living in their present form in the wild and then induced to adopt some less strenuous life from the farm? No. They are, almost all of them, made by us. The essence of artificial selection for a horse or a cow, a grain of rice or a hakey crab is this. Many characteristics are inherited. They breed true. Humans encourage the reproduction of some varieties and discourage the reproduction of others. The variety selected for eventually becomes abundant. The variety selected against becomes rare, maybe extinct. But if artificial selection makes such changes in only a few thousand years, what must natural selection, working for billions of years, be capable of? The answer is all the beauty and diversity in the biological world. That life evolved over the ages is clear from the changes we've made in the beasts and vegetables, but also from the record in the rocks. The fossil evidence speaks to us unambiguously of creatures that were once present in enormous numbers and that have now vanished utterly. There are far more species that have become extinct than exist today. They're the terminated experiments in evolution. These guys, for example, the trilobites, appeared 600 million years ago. They were around for 300 million years. They're all gone. There's none left. But in those old rocks, there are no fossils of people or cattle. We've evolved only recently. Evolution is a fact, not a theory. It really happened.
All right. Well, welcome to part 3. Now that you have a historical foundation of how basically the mystery religion of the ages continued through these various empires and cultures and ultimately found itself in the Catholic Church and the Reformation and all the counter-Reformation stuff that we talked about, now we can look at kind of the last leg of history, which is really the 1800s, and then the section after this will be the 1900s to the present. The French Revolution is when the beast from the bottomless pit that the woman rides in Revelation 17, that's when this beast emerges, which is really the final system, this religio-political manifestation of the mystery religion of the ages through the Catholic system, taking over the world, the New World Order, that whole stuff. That is when it began to emerge. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, watch my End Time series. There's a lot of very edifying episodes there, especially the one on the French Revolution, the episodes on Mystery Babylon, and other places like the false prophet and so on. Today, we're looking at how all of these things integrated, not only in the Catholic Church, but also in the false prophet, which is the United States. Because the false prophet's job is to work signs and wonders and marvels, like the moon landing, to basically deceive people into building an image that honors the beast. An image is a representation, which is a form of government, essentially, because the original beast in Revelation 13 is a power. It's a governmental power. Of course, it has a personal representative, but it's a governmental power. It's an institution, which of course is the papacy. So when the false prophet deceives people into building an image that honors and represents the beast, the Bible's telling you is that this false prophet's role is to convince people into adopting a new world order, a counterfeit Christian new world order where everybody pays homage to the Pope. Again, if all this stuff sounds crazy to you or new, check out my End Time series, because really this is the destiny of America and the destination of history. But how does that tie into cosmology? Well, cosmology, you will see once we get to the 1900s to the modern day, is a very big player in the New World Order scheme, because you can't have globalism without a globe. And of course, all of the things that come with it, climate change, fear of asteroids, alien invasions, uniting under, one Earth and things like that. All those things will start to become very, very obvious once we get to the 1900s in the modern day. And it's starting to get a little more obvious now. So far, we've looked at where the occult origins of these beliefs come from and how Satan wove them into various empires and eventually migrated them into the Catholic system. We saw how the Catholic Church has basically shaped cosmology over the last 500 years. And we know the French Revolution was basically when this final system, the woman riding the beast that comes out of the system, the governmental system, it emerges from the French Revolution, this two-party dialectic, which is destined to annihilate itself and resolve into the final capstone, which is the woman riding the beast, which is the Catholic Church owning, the governments and the kings of the earth, at least for a short period of time, thank God. But nonetheless, this emerges during the French Revolution, meaning what we can expect to see, which you will see today, is that the 1800s and the 1900s were just wave upon wave of satanic activity. Massive satanic activity. Now, historically, the 1800s to the 1900s were jam-packed with very significant developments in science, both in the satanic realm and also in the realm of science, basically, that proved some very important things, like the Earth being motionless, which we'll look at that today as well. But when I do say science, though, what I mean is the mainstream narrative and deception for the most part, because there was some good science that was done in the 1800s. However, that was buried and flipped, and you will see that today. It's important to understand that history, as well as key scientific developments and experiments, which we will discuss, have been given to you through the people that control history. And you'll see what I mean by that today. These experiments that I mentioned, which we'll look at in great detail, which is the Aries failure, Michelson-Morley, Sagnac, I think, is in there as well. There's a couple. There's a couple that you need to be familiar with that ultimately prove that the Earth is motionless, and this was a death blow to heliocentrism. So it prompted an immediate reaction to bring relativity, into science, and basically the rest, as they say, is history. We'll get into all that. I'm building the case. I'm building step by step, and it'll all come together quite nicely, I promise you. But the 1800s basically continued the momentum of the Counter-Reformation and set the stage for massive deception in the 1900s by the false prophet. The 1800s, you have to remember also that America was in flux. The original founding fathers were Freemasons. They were secret society members, but they didn't like the Jesuits, and that's fairly well documented. They knew the wiles and the dangers of the Jesuits, and they knew that the Jesuits would infiltrate America because America had a very, open borders type of government. It's a very new type of government. And as a result, they got infiltrated. And the first couple of presidents were assassinated by the Jesuits. The Jesuits fomented the Civil War. They took over through the Rothschilds in the Act of 1872, which established the corporate nation of the United States, the U.S., Corporation of the USA or whatever. Basically the legal body, which is the federal government. And ever since then, they've been owned by the Jesuits. You also had the 14th Amendment, where you became a citizen of the federal government rather than the citizen of the state. So you had a lot of things that transpired in the 1800s to basically firmly get Rome's grasp solidified over the United States, so that the United States could then be used as the false prophet to work marvelous signs and wonders, which you will see in the 1900s, specifically with heliocentrism and how it leads to this ecumenical situation, which we're dealing with now, with climate change, with everything else that's happened, and of course will continue to happen. So a lot to talk about, a lot of history that's happened, but we're going to begin with this post from ChristianObserver.net, and it's a great article, actually. It's titled, Revivals Part 2, Enlightenment in the Land of the Plumed Serpent. I've talked about this, but America, by the way, is not named after Amerigo Vespucci. In Incan, the name Ameriqua, I believe, is a name that basically honors the plumed serpent that all of these cultures worship, like the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Incans. They all had different names for the plumed serpent, but the Quetzalcoatl, the deity that was the divine serpent with wings and feathers, and of course we know who that is, and who ruled these cultures because they were given over to evil. And so America is literally translated as the land of the plumed serpent. So it's very interesting that that also relates to the false prophet and so on and so forth. The thing that looks like a lamb but speaks like a dragon. But anyway, let's read a little bit about this. The scientific revolution and the age of enlightenment. The scientific revolution and the age of enlightenment are key to the Great Awakening and its revivals, as they represent a return to the mystery school teachings which maintain the serpent's divinity of man. You know the story. Of course, he cites Genesis 3, the temptation. The scientific revolution was spearheaded by mathematician, astronomer, Freemason Nicolaus Copernicus, and culminated in the works of Isaac Newton. Newton was a Protestant, but many of his works, which he kept private, were occult studies. And if you know the art of war and how that works, then there is such a thing as quote-unquote Protestant, and that's important to understand. It's been argued that the development of modern science can and more accurately should be presented in two phases. The scientific renaissance, which is the 15th and 16th centuries, which focused on restoring the natural knowledge of the ancients, and the scientific revolution, which is the 17th century, when scientists shifted from recovering ancient knowledge to innovation. From Wikipedia, the era of the scientific renaissance focused to some degree on recovering the knowledge of the ancients, and is considered to have culminated in the 1687 Isaac Newton publication Principia, which formulated the laws of motion and universal gravitation, thereby completing the synthesis of a new cosmology. A new cosmology. And remember, he discovered gravity in 1666. I'm sure that had nothing to do with anything. The Enlightenment, roughly 1715 to 1789. So now this follows the scientific revolution. Followed on the heels of the scientific revolution, it represented a great shift away from faith in absolute religious or political authority, in faith in scientific reason and secularism. Just like with the French Revolution, how it separated government from religion, science was also given a separation of spirituality from scientific inquiry, where you started to see atheistic science, because again, all of these things have to go dark to light and come back to the Mother Church. Now we're seeing science become more of a moral issue. Climate change is no longer an atheistic liberal thing. It is a moral issue, but you don't understand that change and how it was orchestrated unless you see these arcs of history over 200, 250 years, 300 years. It was the birth of the humanist individualism with optimistic ideas about human nature, seeing man as essentially good, instead of what the Bible teaches, that man is dead in sin, having no life in himself whatsoever. True. This is the foundation of all of these things, that man can choose the good, and therefore if you can choose the good, you can choose free of influence. You don't need to be governed by God. You can govern yourself, and you can be like God. Enlightenment ideas were based on the works of occultist Francis Bacon and Freemason John Locke. Did you know that Locke was involved in the African slave trade? I didn't. Anyway, the scientific revolution and the age of enlightenment established a new way of thinking, sweeping away the old. In step with the Enlightenment thinking, Great Awakening preachers referred to the new light as a fresh revelation of the gospel as opposed to the old light held by conventional Christianity. There was a Great Awakening in the 1800s as well. There was a lot going on in the 1800s and 1700s and 1800s. There's a lot of parallel things happening. There was a revival, and it was Great Awakening, the true Great Awakening, where people were coming to the gospel. But there was also a lot of counterfeit believers, counterfeit prophets, counterfeit preachers and so on. You had the Enlightenment. You had this scientism being developed. It was very dynamic. The enemy is not losing any time, in the sense that they're not wasting any time, I should say. Very busy while God is unfolding his plan and cannot be stopped. The enemy is constantly, basically trying to counterfeit it and doing all sorts of things. Championed his progress, the scientific revolution and the Age of Enlightenment were actually a return to ancient mystery school thought. Now we'll all read and seen videos about the mystery schools, their mother-son sex cults, sun worship, and the symbolism we see just about everywhere these days. But in order to understand how the Age of Enlightenment affected the great American revivals, we need to take a more practical look at how the mystery schools once controlled the world. A good way to do that, and since the enlightened thinker Francis Bacon wrote about it, is to visit the subject of Atlantis. In Francis Bacon's unfinished utopian novel, The New Atlantis, published posthumously in 1626, the Americas are presented as the location of the lost mythical civilization of Atlantis. From the novel, quote, "About 3,000 years ago or somewhere more, the great Atlantis that you call America abounded then in tall ships. Of all this there is with you sparing memory or none, but we have large knowledge thereof." Francis Bacon, The New Atlantis. Several physical places have been suggested as the possible location of Atlantis. I think just a little quick break, but I think the most logical one is in Africa, West Africa. There's actually some very interesting research there if you look into it, how you can see the flood had come into Africa and then receded, and there's these concentric rings and stuff. I forget where exactly in West Africa it is, but it's very interesting. But anyway, the point is that these people believed America had this manifest destiny, this destiny to basically bring the light to the world, which of course the Bible tells you, because the Bible says that the United States is the false prophet. But as Freemason Manly P. Hall explained in his lectures, Bacon's Atlantis was not a city or a country. Rather, his novel presents a university of thought. Like universities today, Bacon's Atlantis taught all manner of public thought, including science, mathematics, and governance. In light of that, it is noteworthy how many of our universities, Bible colleges, and seminaries have been founded by the Jesuits and Freemasons, which is true. You remember, Rome was the one that created the university model in the 1300s or something. During the same year, in 1303, Pope Boniface the eighth? Yeah. Issued the In Suprema Preeminentia Dignitalis bull and founded the Studium Urbis, Rome's first university. There you go. Straight from the article, the university was erected outside the Vatican walls, and while this did not completely resolve the many issues between the university and the clergy, it surely catalyzed the new relationship between the city of Rome and the many scholars that arrived at new universities from around the world. So Rome created the university model in order to what? Control education. And this was before the Counter-Reformation, which is interesting. Of course, by the time you had the Counter-Reformation, there were universities everywhere, and today you have the university model. People would get indoctrinated with Jesuit ideas, Jesuit cosmology, Jesuit science, and so Rome controls the times and the laws. Plato, 5th century, also describes the mythical city in his work Timaeus. Manly P. Hall discusses Plato's Atlantis in his The Secret Destiny of America. He describes it here. The idea of Atlantis being a physical place was popularized by theosophist Helena Blavatsky, who also lived in the 1800s. Well, her and Donovan. Blavatsky dated the continent of Atlantis to an evolutionary 850,000 years ago in her 1877 book Isis Unveiled. Blavatsky insisted that Plato, an initiate, deliberately used hidden language in his dating of the island some 9,000 years ago. Regardless of whether it ever existed physically, it's likely that these same intellectual ideas governed the great civilization in Noah's day when men did only evil all the time. That's right, there was a new world order before the flood, folks. And Satan's been trying to get back at that since then. And God has allowed him to do it at the very end. But all that's going to happen is bringing back what used to be, which is the religio-political mystery religion controlling the entire world. Genesis chapter 11 records how, after God destroyed that evil generation with the great flood, men reformed Atlantis and Babylon. Basically, God dispersed the people by confusing their languages and separating the earth in the days of Peleg. But Atlantis was formed once again in Alexandria and Athens, and as Bacon's novel suggests, in the great Maya and Aztec empires. That's right, remember, every empire has an expiration date. So Satan is constantly moving things from one thing to another. And then when that one starts to get judged, okay, let's move them over here, let's move them over there. And so he has an unbroken chain of transmission from the pre-flood era all the way through these mystery religions and cults and secret societies and governments and empires and so on to the modern day, which is the Catholic Church. There's Alice Bailey. The Atlantean ideals are the natural knowledge of the ancients that was rediscovered by the key figures of the scientific Renaissance, scientific revolution, and the Age of Enlightenment. These are different waves, folks. And again, you have to see that the devil works through waves in history. You had the scientific Renaissance, then this is the revolution, then the Enlightenment. All of these things are wave after wave of new generations doing and repackaging the old thing into the new thing. The same ideals are the stated goals of those wanting to bring about a great coming world religion and governance. What is remarkable is how they are utilizing Christianity to bring it all about. The blend of Enlightenment thought and Protestantism that holds the betterment of humanity over the individual soul brings the words of Theosophist Alice Bailey to mind. Quote, "The Christian Church and its many branches can serve as St. John the Baptist, as a voice crying into wilderness, and as a nucleus through which world illumination may be accomplished." Remember, Alice Bailey was neck deep in the devil's soup. So this is what she's telling you, which is very much in line with the Bible telling you that the United States is the false prophet that looks like a lamb but speaks like a dragon and works false signs and wonders to convince people to worship the beast. I indicate the hope. I do not assert a fact. Its work is intended to be the holding of a broad platform. The church must show a wide tolerance and teach no revolutionary doctrines or cling to any reactionary ideas. The church, as a teaching factor, should take the great basic doctrines and, shattering the old forms in which they were expressed and held, show their true and inner spiritual significance. The prime work of the church is to teach, and to teach ceaselessly, i.e. learning against learning, preserving the outer appearance in order to reach the many who are accustomed to church usages. Teachers must be trained, Bible knowledge must be spread, the sacraments must be mystically interpreted, and the power of the church to heal must be demonstrated. I wonder if Alice Bailey was a Jesuit too. There is no question, therefore, that the work to be done in familiarizing the general public with the nature of the mysteries is of paramount importance at this time. These mysteries will be restored to outer expression through the medium of the church and the Masonic fraternity. If those groups leave off being organizations with material purpose and become organisms with living objectives. So, Masonic mystery religion manifesting through the church is what needs to happen to externalize the hierarchy. Spoken to you by a Satanist, which confirms what the Bible says, that basically the mystery religion of the ages will be manifest through the Catholic Church. Moving on. Is America a Freemason Jesuit experiment? Is its tolerant, self-worshipping, social cause-promoting Christianity all designed to extinguish the gospel, undo the Reformation, and bring about a return to Catholicism, aka the mystery schools? Don't doubt it. Now, I don't know if this person is an Adventist, because usually only Adventists believe, the historicist perspective. I mean, I should say not only Adventists, but mostly Adventists believe the historicist interpretation that America is the false prophet and the beast is the Catholic system with the Pope at its head, of course, and everything we talk about. So I'm very interested if this person is an Adventist or not. Not that, that matters. Ultimately, if you're an Adventist, then you should get out of Adventism, but it's just interesting to see other people talk about this. If you've been following the development of the New World Order for any length of time, you're aware of these changes in the churches today. But there's still a lot of confusion and arguing over various church doctrines, all of which really boil down to law and mysticism. Let's look at what else was going on in the days of Bacon and Locke. Roughly chronologically, we have the following: Scientific Renaissance, Reformation, Reformers and Separatists begin to settle in North America. Then you have Francis Bacon. Then you have the Jesuit missions to North America, which is where they practiced communism for 150 years and made a ton of money. Then you had John Locke. This is Europa Amaru and the missions of the Jesuits. If you don't know about those, then I highly recommend you look into them. As Protestants fled the persecution of the Roman Catholic Church in Europe in 16th and 17th centuries, the Jesuits were conquering and converting the people of the Americas to Catholicism. In South America, the god of the Aztecs and Mayans was Quetzalcoatl, known as the bearded white god. So when the bearded white man came to their land and the natives believed that that was their god returning, made the mission to convert the natives much more successful, although the conversions played out as more of a blending of faiths. In North America and Peru, Quetzalcoatl was known as the two-headed god Amaru. Like the phoenix, Amaru represents the blending of the realms. It represents the sudden and sometimes violent overturning of the established order. The tribes of North America and Peru resisted conversion, and the Jesuit missions in North America arguably played out as more of an ethnic cleansing there, just in time for the settlers to begin arriving in Europe. Now, I don't know if there's a relation between that, because definitely the Pilgrims were trying to get away from Catholicism and from religious oppression. So there's that. But definitely the Jesuits did infiltrate America. That is very well documented. What's in a name? America Amaruca. We're told that America was named after explorer Amerigo Vespucci, but the name more likely comes from the Incan two-headed serpent god Amaru, plumed serpent or feathered serpent. Amaruca is literally translated land of the plume serpent or plumed serpents. So some interesting things there about basically the chronology of how we get into the 1800s with the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, all of these waves of digging up the occult back again. Remember, Rome had all the occult knowledge. They had no reason to really weaponize it. And ultimately, once the Reformation started happening and they were losing the iron grip control, the reason to weaponize education and occult knowledge and to get it out and disseminate it in culture and start universities and all this stuff was really very obvious, because they needed to shift from a militaristic kind of control, iron-fisted, to seduction and infiltration and narratives and propaganda and entertainment and all the things that you see today. So it's very important you understand that the Reformation shifted Rome's approach to control. And of course, the Bible tells you it's going to have control in the way that it used to have at the very end, which is going to be an iron fist. And once that comes the case, then the time is very short. So rejoice when you see these things happening. But nevertheless, all of these things show a continual infiltration into society through science, through occultism, through all sorts of mediums. Many things were set up in the 1800s, and the 1800s were very satanic. The Renaissance, the Jesuit missions, famous occultists like Copernicus, Newton, Bacon, Locke, all these people were occultist folks. They're just Freemasons or Jesuit infiltrators or secret society members or alchemists or occultists. Doesn't really matter. They're all serving Satan one way or another. They're not born-again Christians, that's for sure. The Enlightenment was one of many, many waves of satanic activity to kind of keep shaping culture and to ultimately bring the world back to the beast. Remember that Mystery Babylon is not just the Catholic Church. Mystery Babylon is the religion of the ages, manifesting itself in the church age as the Catholic Church. Satan in the church age gave his power and throne and great authority to the Catholic system, to the beast, to the Pope, to the papal institution. And that power is not just power that kind of showed up. It's the power that he's had through the mystery religion of all time, from the very beginning, where he deceived mankind. And he created a new world order before the flood. That power has been transferred to the Catholic Church in the church age. So all the mystery occult knowledge that's being resurfaced and so popular and so, ubiquitous in our lives is because we're at the end, which is a very important point. The 1800s Enlightenment period also came out of the French Revolution and atheism and all the things that we talked about previously with the bottomless pit and the Jesuits taking over America. Now, I want to look at another thing. These are just going to be line item things, but just to plot the picture of how the 1800s set the stage for massive deception in the 1900s, for the false prophet working all these miracles through learning against learning, through shaping culture, and so on and so forth. So you've learned about these movements like the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, how it's, all these things were led by occultists. You had learning against learning, you had the Jesuit infiltrations, you had the university model, you had the encyclopedia, you had the French Revolution, on and on and on. So much stuff has been proliferating after the Counter-Reformation. Of course, you also have the Smithsonian, which was very influential. This is from gracedemay.org. A Mason's Mysterious Gift to America. Very important you understand that the Smithsonian is also a Freemason experiment. Where are you? And you didn't save my highlights, did you? There you are. You just got to refresh sometimes, even if they're misbehaving. Okay. In 1765, why don't you do what you're supposed to do? Isn't that funny? It just disappears. Okay. In 1765, Elizabeth Hungerford Keat Macy fled from England to Paris to give birth to a baby boy. The child, originally named Jack Louis Macy, was the illegitimate son of the first Duke of Northumberland. The child's birth was twinged with even more scandal, as Elizabeth was a cousin of the Duchess of Northumberland. Drama of the nobles. What kind of future would this child have? Well, the truth is that young Jack Louis, later anglicized to James Macy, would grow up to not only become an accomplished scientist, chemist, and mineralogist, but also would become world famous. Following the death of his parents, James felt it was time to take the last name of his biological father, Hugh Smithson, a.k.a. the Duke of Northumberland. Let's see, how far do I have to read? Sorry, this is annoying me. As a young man growing up during the Age of Enlightenment, James had a natural curiosity and a belief in the rights of mankind, liberty, equality, and justice, which led him to become a Freemason. That's all you really need to know, but let's keep going. James Smithson devoted his life to scientific investigations. Of course, if you know the people that were in that time doing quote-unquote scientific investigations, really that means occultism. He never married nor sired children. When he wrote his will in his later years, he bequeathed his considerable fortune and worldly goods to a nephew. However, his will stated that if the nephew died without an heir, that all of his entire fortune was to be given to the United States of America and be used to found the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. The terms of Smithson's will dictated that this institution would be an establishment for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men. The generous gift was most astounding considering that James Smithson had never set foot in America. In 1846, U.S. President James K. Polk signed the Smithsonian Institution Act to acknowledge and fulfill the wishes of James Smithson, even though the question of why the noted scientist chose America as his beneficiary remains a mystery to this day. Well, if you know the Bible, it's not a mystery, folks. And if you know who's pulling the strings. Smithson's gift was the equivalent of $15 million. Upon Smithson's death in Italy in 1829, his remains were buried in Genoa. However, 75 years later, another Freemason and scientist, Alexander Graham Bell, very famous person, traveled to Genoa to oversee exhumation of James Smithson's remains. Bell, who served as a Smithsonian regent, not only had the remains exhumed, he also documented, and his wife Mabel photographed the exhumation process and the skull of James Smithson, and made scientific notations before bringing the remains to America for internment within the Smithsonian Institution. Now, that sounds all scientific, but if you know these occult people and how they worship death and how they do all sorts of weird things with their rituals, and it doesn't surprise me that they would exhume his body and bring it to the Smithsonian. That's just weird. The images of the exhumation and remains are part of the collection of the Library of Congress and denoted, my gosh, there's a wave of motorcycles passing through here, denoted by Alexander Graham Bell's son-in-law, Dr. Gilbert Grosvenor. Today, the Smithsonian is not only recognized as a national treasure, it has served as inspiration for generations who, like Smithson, have minds that are curious. From the founding of the Smithsonian, the Institute has expanded to include 20 separate museums and the National Zoo. Together, the museums account for nearly 150 million objects, from mineral specimens to displays of the gowns of America's first ladies to priceless works of art. More than 25 million people visit the Smithsonian museums each year. So, do they have an impact on learning? Of course they do. In his final years of life, James Smithson penned his personal philosophy, quote, "It is in his knowledge that man has found his greatness and his happiness." Does that sound like James Smithson died believing the forbidden fruit? Absolutely. He was a Freemason. He was an occultist. He was all about secret knowledge. And the Smithsonian is founded in his honor. And he chose America of all places. I wonder why he chose America, because the Jesuits by that point were in control and needed America to become the false prophet of basically controlling the narratives and bringing the new light to the world. So it doesn't surprise me that the Smithsonian was founded in America. Now, I won't spend too much time on the Smithsonian. You can do your own research and digging, but there are a lot of conspiracies with the Smithsonian. They have a lot of cover-ups in history, and they're involved in a lot of shady business. Dinosaur cover-ups in the 1800s, forgeries, giant skeleton cover-ups with basically discovering Nephilim bones and things like that. A lot of cover-ups with that. There's the Grand Canyon conspiracy, if you know anything about, which is very fascinating. Who knows? Who knows? I do think that history is not what we've been told. And of course, if you are the power that wants to control the narrative, then you're going to create an institution that controls all aspects of history. All these narratives, all these archaeological discoveries, the Smithsonian was right on top of them, especially in the 1800s, when all these things were very unregulated. So a lot of really suspicious things about the Smithsonian, but interesting things to note are the following. The Smithsonian was founded just in time to promote the new cosmology to the world through things like evolution, through the things that were changing with, cosmological science and gravity and things like that. In 1846, it was signed into law with the Smithsonian Act. In 1858, Darwin, who was also a Freemason and from a Freemason family, publishes his treatise on evolution. Smithsonian was founded by a Freemason, and of course, the rest, as they say, is history. Now, the next thing I want to show you is the Cosmos Club. This is from Wikipedia, and you can see it good. The Cosmos Club is a 501c3 or 501c7 private, get out of here, social club in Washington, D.C. that was founded by John Wesley Powell in 1878 as a gentleman's club for those interested in science. Among its stated goals is the advancement of its members in science, literature, and art, and also their mutual improvement by social intercourse, i.e. it's a secret society. Cosmos Club members include 3 United States presidents, 2 vice presidents, U.S. Supreme Court justices, artists, writers, businessmen, government officials, journalists, scientists, and university presidents, 36 Nobel Prize winners, 61 Pulitzer Prize winners, and 55 Presidential Medal of Freedom recipients. In 1988, the club opened to women. Does this sound like a secret society so far? Of course it does. History. According to one history, Clarence Edward Dutton, which we will come back to, originally had the idea for a social club for men of science and shared his idea with Major John Wesley Powell. On November 16th, 1878, a group of men met at Powell's home in 910 M Street, Washington, D.C., and discussed their mutual interest in creating what began the Cosmos Club. There are no minutes of attendance records from the organizational meeting. However, oral history says 12 attended the meeting. Well, there's probably 13. If you know what that means. 10 signed the Articles of Incorporation 3 weeks later, and Powell was selected as the club's temporary president. The original incorporators included, and so on and so forth. According to the Articles of Incorporation, quote, the particular objects and business of this association are the advancements of its members in science, literature, and art, their mutual improvement by social intercourse, the acquisition and maintenance of the library, and the collection and care of materials and appliances related to the above objects. In other words, to control learning against learning. And if you know that, then you can interpret these things very clearly. If you look up the Cosmos Club logo, oh, it didn't do it. Let's look it up. Cosmos Club logo. Sometimes it doesn't keep the search queries. Here we go. What do you see in this logo? Take a look. Take a nice look at it. See if we can zoom in a little bit better. There it is. You can see a little bit better. Do you see something interesting here? Well, you actually see a couple of things that are interesting. You see there's a globe. And of course, people hadn't been to space yet with wings. That's interesting. I wonder if they were planning to do something with space maybe long before they went to space. And at the top, what do you see? An illuminated eye with, several rays of light coming out and so on. 6 stars. Very Masonic imagery. Washington, D.C., 1878, the Cosmos Club. So that's very important because the Cosmos Club also led to National Geographic. This is from, where is this from? This is from the Grand Canyon Mystery. And I think this is talking about the founder of the Cosmos Club. Yeah, here we go. Clarence Dutton. A quick study of Clarence Dutton's life drums up images of Indiana Jones, only a bit more refined. Mr. Dutton was a soldier, geologist, and poet. Quite the combination, and one that obviously served him well. He is most known for his work, The Tertiary History of the Grand Canyon District, which today is still the definitive work on the geology of the Grand Canyon. His earlier work, Report on the Geology of the High Plateaus of Utah, most certainly caught the attention of John Powell. Powell became so impressed with Dutton's work, he appointed him head of the Department of Volcanic Geology at the U.S. Geological Survey. Dutton went out on study to study and write reports on the volcanoes of Hawaii and the Crater Lake in Oregon, all the while waxing his words with poetically infused language. He was a man quite moved by natural beauty and didn't separate his love of geology from that of the written word. Gosh, what a lover of nature and a philanthropic, curious student of life. Let's read more. While I can find no confirmation that Mr. Dutton was a Freemason, he most certainly had connections with some of the most powerful and well-known people, not only within his scientific community, but people in positions of considerable power. Men who were forging a new nation and on the frontier of its exploration and development. Dutton graduated from Yale, ding, 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 in 1860, and while attended was regarded as a cultural polymath and raconteur. He was a lover of chess as well as a skilled gymnast. His senior year, he won the Yale Literary Award for an essay he wrote on the novels of Charles Kingsley. In short, he was quite the accomplished young man. Directly out of school, he went on to serve as a first lieutenant for the 21st Connecticut Regiments in the Civil War, where he saw some pretty rough fighting. Dutton was also quite fond of societies. And again, while I can find no proof of connection to Freemasonry, he certainly was a member of many societies at the time, helped to create several of them himself. He obviously had a fondness for brotherhood, and no doubt would have kept many friends who were Freemasons. It was not uncommon for a man to be a member of several societies, or even secret societies simultaneously in those days. Not too uncommon today either. Don't forget, he attended Yale. Need I mention the infamous Skull and Bone Society formed at the campus in 1832? The same secret society George Bush and John Kerry are members of today. Government-sanctioned secret societies. On January 13, 1888, 33 men got together and formed a geographical society. 33 got together to form the society. A week later, Charles Dutton sat as the chairman of that society, and it formalized into the National Geographic Society, which came from the Cosmos Club too as well. This group was made of scientists, adventurers, and explorers. It also included a journalist and a superintendent from the National Zoo. Remember who owns the National Zoo? The Smithsonian, who was founded by a Freemason. Dutton rubbed elbows with John Wesley Powell, J.K. Gilbert, Henry Gannett, W.J. McGee, Charles D. Walcott, and William Holmes. He was also a member of the Cosmos Club, the Philosophical Society, the Geological Society, and a society within the Geographical Society known as the Great Basin Mess. While I can find no record of Freemasonry in Mr. Dutton's life, I find it interesting that the society he helped to create and chaired was founded by 33 men. 33 men of power and influence. 33 being, of course, the highest honorary degree in the Scottish Rite tradition of Freemasonry, and found throughout all of the said society. Although naysayers will be quick to point out that this proves nothing, I personally don't believe it to be simply a coincidence. These scientists, who obviously worked with some of the most powerful people in government at the time, men of the military and high government background, granted these explorers full run of the entire Grand Canyon region. Of course, you know why they did that, because they were exploring the artifacts there. Look into the Grand Canyon conspiracy. It's very fascinating. They were funded and outfitted with provisions and the protection necessary to explore and document the entire Colorado Plateau. It stands to reason that if something was discovered within the walls of this Great Canyon, that they would have been first to find it. And the fact that much of the Grand Canyon is named with the ancient Hindu and Egyptian gods leads many to imagine that something Egyptian, or at the very least non-Native American, was indeed discovered there. Yeah, interesting stuff. History is a mystery, folks. At least some of it. In their book, The Suppressed History of America, Paul Schrag and Xaviant Hazé make a great argument that early U.S. expeditions were actually sent out not to only discover a new continent, but to help control what findings and information became available to the public as official history. True. Until researching this article, I never put together the similarities between the National Geographic Society of the U.S. and the Royal Geographic Society of England. Both began as private societies of learned men and soon after became recognized by their governments. Those governments then recruited and funded the organizations to explore new lands for national imperialism and military superiority. On one hand, these societies consisted of a group of scientists pushing the limits of their respective fields, while on the other, they were often doing so in the capacity of their government. The movie Raiders of the Lost Ark plays on this very idea when Dr. Jones is recruited to retrieve the Ark of the Covenant on behalf of the U.S. government before the Nazis find it first. My question is, how can anyone expect the discoveries of any government-sanctioned expedition to be transparent when the nature of government is intrinsically secretive to begin with? That's true. So what do you get? I mean, let's look at some of these pictures too, and we'll talk about it. But these are old pictures. Look at this pterodactyl that these people found. This is not AI, folks. These are old pictures. Civil War, these people killed a giant pterodactyl. It's fascinating. People would find these old pterosaurs or flying dinosaurs back in the 1800s. And the Indians would call them thunderbirds. That's where the word thunderbird comes from. We have like a lot of stuff here in Phoenix where like Thunderbird College or, Thunderbird Avenue. But Thunderbird is named after these giant pterodactyls that were still alive after the flood. And of course, some creatures made it. And of course, they went extinct and for the most part. But it just shows you all these things. Here's some petroglyphs and things that are very fascinating things, especially the Grand Canyon stuff. Again, if you looked into the mystery of the Grand Canyon, it's been very hush-hush with all the stuff that they found. They're supposedly Egyptian type things and just very interesting, very, very fascinating stuff. History is not what we've been told. And of course, government and secret societies have been in cahoots for a while. And of course, who controls that? The Jesuits, the satanic power on the earth that Satan gave his throne to in the church age. And Clarence Dutton, who founded the Cosmos Club, who was part of all these secret societies, rubbing elbows with these people, very much into that kind of stuff. Whether he was a Freemason, a Jesuit, an occultist, who knows? It's hard to tell because this was a while ago, but it's very clear that he wasn't a born-again Christian. He was a mystic. He was an occultist. He was in the same tradition of men like Isaac Newton, Copernicus, and so on and so forth, John Locke, and all these guys. These people were working for the beast, whether indirectly or directly, doesn't matter. But the Cosmos Club did what? Cosmos Club, it shows you that there's influential organizations connected to secret societies, to the beast, eventually, to government. And of course, knowing the political climate of the times that I just described to you in the 1800s with the United States, the influence of the Jesuits, it's not hard to assume that Dutton was probably a Jesuit spy or a secret society member. I don't think that's a stretch. The logo of the Cosmos Club has a illuminated eye over a globe with some wings when space was not even a thing for like 100 years, which is very interesting. And the Cosmos Club launched many other important things like National Geographic's. Other physics organizations were launched from that later in the 1900s were very influential. So all these things show you that there's exoteric and esoteric. On the outside, exoteric, you see a social club of elite scientists just pursuing the common good and wanting the best for humanity and enriching knowledge. Of course, on the inside, the esoteric, you have these all occult-initiated people that are doing the bidding of their masters, controlling information, and the rest, as they say, is history. Let's talk about evolution and Darwin. This is the Lunar Society of Birmingham, which is kind of like the Cosmos Club, but it was before the Cosmos Club. The Lunar Society of Birmingham was a British dinner club and informal learned society of prominent figures in the Midlands Enlightenment, including industrialists, natural philosophers, intellectuals, who met regularly between 1765 and 1813 in Birmingham. At first called the Lunar Circle, Lunar Society became the formal name by 1775. The name arose because the society would meet during the full moon, as the extra light made the journey home easier and safer in the absence of street lighting. Now again, if you believe that, I have a beachfront property to sell you in Phoenix. It's going hot, folks. Let's keep going. The members cheerfully refer to themselves as lunatics, a contemporary spelling of lunatics, spelled with a K instead of just CK instead of just a C. Venues included Erasmus Darwin's home in Lichfield, Matthew Bolton's home, Soho House, Bowbridge House in Derbyshire, and Great Bar Hall. So, Lunar Society. What's to know about the Lunar Society? Well, despite this uncertainty, 14 individuals have been identified as having verifiably attended Lunar Society meetings regularly over a long period during its most productive eras. these people were, and so on and so forth, but one of them was Erasmus Darwin. I think you also have, where is he? Joseph Priestley, who was very influential with the founding fathers. Thomas Jefferson idolized Joseph Priestley. And Benjamin Franklin is in there as well somewhere, I think. But you had a lot of these very influential scientists and scientific people. Let's see, was there somewhere that Benjamin Franklin? I'm sure I saw Ben Franklin here. Let's see, Franklin. Yeah, Benjamin Franklin. Here he is. He was in the Lunar Society. So very influential little club that these people were in. Of course, if you look into Erasmus Darwin, he was a Freemason. Born 1731, died 1802, was an English physician, one of the key thinkers of the Midlands Enlightenment. He was also a natural philosopher, physiologist, slave trade abolitionist, inventor, Freemason, and poet. His poems included much natural history, including a statement of evolution and the relatedness of the forms of life. Very important that you understand Erasmus Darwin, because Charles Darwin was just a puppet. He was just continuing the work. It was Erasmus that really began this, and of course Satan uses generation to generation to evolve these things over time. But Erasmus was the progenitor of the theory of evolution. Of course, I mean, the theory of evolution is nothing new in that sense. It's the forbidden fruit that man can ultimately create his own destiny. But Erasmus Darwin, who was Charles Darwin's grandfather, was the first. Moving on. He was a member of the Darwin-Wedgwood family, which included his grandsons Charles Darwin and Francis Galton. Darwin was a founding member of the Lunar Society, a discussion group of pioneering industrialists and natural philosophers. He turned down an invitation from George III to become physician to the king. I think there was something else. Yeah, here we go. Freemasonry. Darwin had been a Freemason throughout his life. In the time immemorial lodge of Canongate Kilwinning, No. 2 of Scotland. Later on, Sir Francis Darwin, one of his sons, was made a Mason in Tyrian Lodge at Derby in 1807-1808. His son Reginald was made a Mason in Tyrian Lodge in 1804. Charles Darwin's name does not appear on the rolls of the lodge, but it is very possible that he, like Francis, was a Mason. I'll let you be the judge of that because it's pretty obvious. You can see, for example, the picture of, we'll look at it with Charles Darwin doing the little sh sound. This is from, where is this from? This is from Dr. David Harrison. Freemasonry, the Lunar Society, and the Midlands Enlightenment. A little more on this topic. Though it had somewhat loose style of membership, to say the least, the Lunar Society was an example of like-minded men, or lunatics as they styled themselves, working together for a positive aim to promote natural philosophy, which of course is antichrist. It is against Christ and in place of Christ as a counterfeit salvation. There were no minutes, no constitution, and no actual membership list. I wonder why. So only correspondence between members survive to provide an insight into the group. One of the leading members of the society was Erasmus Darwin, a physician, poet, and Freemason who was a close friend to many who were linked to the society, such as Josiah Wedgwood and Matthew Boulton. As the 18th century progressed, the idea of immortality became embraced by forward-thinking Freemasons, such as Erasmus Darwin, who expressed immortality in his poem The Temple of Nature, discussing modern ideas of immortality with a natural philosophical approach. Darwin studied biology amongst the other aspects of natural philosophy and put forward early ideas of biological evolution in his Zoonomia. The Botanic Garden, Darwin used Rosicrucian themes of spirits and fairies to symbolize the elements, and the older magical images being used to represent new scientific thought. Is it really new? Or is it just the old stuff being repackaged over and over again? It was this new exploration into natural philosophy and the search for immortality that became an inspiration for Mary Shelley's work, Frankenstein. Darwin's theories of artificial production of life and regeneration of nature was seen as a direct influence of the Gothic classic, giving Mary Shelley a nightmare vision of a resurrection and immortality within the realms of natural philosophy, i.e. a counterfeit resurrection, which is transhumanism. Do you see how all these things are so old, folks? They're so old, and if you know your history, you can see that truly there's nothing new under the sun. Another Masonic natural philosopher and friend of Darwin, who has also been linked to the Lunar Society, was Benjamin Franklin, who may have also inspired the name of Shelley's masterpiece, Franklin's Experiments with Lightning Rods being an influence. Counterfeit immortality, counterfeit way of saving yourself, which of course is Antichrist. So Lunar Society was very influential because it was during the Enlightenment. And specifically, the Lunar Society was founded by Charles Darwin's grandfather, who was a Mason. Very, very important to understand. This is from some site that's not loading. Okay, well, we're back. That was a wild goose chase. The link doesn't work because it's got taken down. The Wayback Machine is not loading, so I had to find another Wayback Machine alternative, which is called the Memento Project. And so finally, here's the link. This is from the Scottish Rite website. Famous Freemason Erasmus Darwin. When you hear the surname Darwin, Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution often are the only things that come to mind. However, his grandfather Erasmus Darwin is a fascinating man and a Freemason. Brother Darwin was born on December 12, 1731 to Robert Darwin and Elizabeth Elston in England. His father was a prominent lawyer and physician, and he is named after his ancestor Erasmus Earl, who was a common sergeant of law under Oliver Cromwell. After primary school, he attended St. John's College at the University of Edinburgh Medical School. His work in the medical field was unmatched. Yada yada. While working, he would document his findings, observations, and ideas in different books and poems. One of these books, Zoonomia, dealt with biological life and theorized the concept of evolution. Another book of his used the ideas of great thinkers like Locke, who was also a Freemason, and Rousseau, also an occultist, to justify the formal education of women, believing that they should be educated in science and philosophy. They should have the forbidden fruit too, folks. Now, again, of course, everybody should have a scientific mindset. You should. But remember that the science to these people is not simply scientific inquiry. Their fundamental perspective is that man is good, man can govern himself, and therefore man can use the tools that he's been given to save himself. Science to these people is not just experiments. It is a method and a means. It's a counterfeit gospel to self-salvation. You cannot divorce this kind of science and these scientific quote-unquote pursuits from the occult. In 1755, Brother Darwin began to form the Lunar Society. The society was a social group of learned men who met together and discussed different ideas on full moons. I wonder why the full moon. Some men in the group included Dr. William Small, who taught Thomas Jefferson at William and Mary College, engineer James Watt, who improved the steam engine, and chemist Joseph Priestley, who discovered oxygen in the carbon cycle. Prominent American Benjamin Franklin visited the Lunar Society and developed a lifelong friendship with Brother Darwin. Bet you didn't know that. History is so interesting. Outside the Lunar Society and his work as a physician, he was also an avid inventor. According to biography published on him in 2005, he feared that his inventions would ruin his reputation as a doctor and instead gave the ideas to friends to patent. Some of his inventions include a horizontal windmill, Ackermann linkage, an early copy machine, and a drawing of a rocket nozzle. That's interesting, isn't it? Some of these would not come to fruition until centuries later, but his work was integral in laying the groundwork. After moving to Derby, England in 1780, he became a Mason at Canongate Kilwinning Lodge No. 2. In Scotland, his activity in lodge is not known, but Masonry continued in his family with his sons Francis and later descendant Reginald Darwin joining the lodge. And probably Charles, too. Who knows what Charles was up to. Blah, blah, blah. After a couple years more, he died in 1802, and the exact cause of his death is not known, but he was known to have inflammation of the chest, which was most likely exacerbated by a seizure, describing as a violent fit of passion with which he was seized. His memory lives on, and so on and so forth. If you look into Charles Darwin and his little mannerisms, there's nothing new, folks. This symbol, the sh symbol, is a satanic symbol. When these people do it in Hollywood, they're paying homage to their mystery religion. If you look into, for example, Harpocrates. Harpocrates, English Phoenician, is the god of silence, secrets, and confidentiality in the Hellenistic religion. Developed in the Ptolemaic Alexandria, and also an embodiment of hope, according to Plutarch. Greeks adapted Harpocrates from the Egyptian child god Horus, who represented the newborn sun rising each day at dawn. So when they do this little thing with their lips and they're doing it's an Antichrist thing, and it's also designed to pay homage to the sun and to their mystery religion. From Egypt to Greece to Rome to today. Nothing new under the sun. The name Harpocrates originated as a Hellenization of the Egyptian Harpakered or Herupakered, meaning Horus the child. Depictions showed Horus as a naked boy with his finger to his mouth, a realization of the hieroglyph for child. Misunderstanding this gesture, later Greeks and Romans poets made Harpocrates the god of silence and of secrecy. So this is what they're doing when they're paying homage to their little religion when they do that. And Charles Darwin has a famous picture doing that. And his father was it his father or his uncles were Freemasons? His grandfather was a Freemason. You do the math. Very, very simple to do the math. So, conclusion, Erasmus Darwin, who was the grandfather of Charles Darwin, was a Freemason and had Freemason children. Erasmus started the Lunar Society, which was before the Cosmos Club, with other Freemasons, was very much influential in shaping Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, through Joseph Priestley. All these people were peas in a pod, folks. Erasmus was the one who came up with the idea of evolution, not Charles Darwin. Darwin was just continuing the work. Erasmus was also setting the foundation for transhumanism with his idea of basically synthetic immortality, of how to achieve immortality, which is fascinating to think that this stuff goes back way before, the sci-fi era of the last couple decades. These are false signs and wonders that are coming out of the United States as the false prophet already in the 1800s, soon after the French Revolution. Charles Darwin was also an occultist, we know that, through his symbolism and through the fact that he paid homage to this evolutionary mindset that ultimately the man can save himself. He can keep getting better and doesn't need God. Obviously, Charles Darwin did not believe in God. He had his own God. Now, it's very important, it would take a little break here to understand why evolution is impossible. Because I think that's the first step. If you're struggling with heliocentrism, or if you know people who are struggling with heliocentrism, the first step to dismantling that spell in people's minds is realizing that evolution is nonsense. It is impossible. It is a spiritual belief system, not an actual scientific and experimentally based, empirical evidence-based system or idea. It's important as Christians to reject evolution because it's antichrist. And of course, it opens the door to other deceptions. Evolution is not science. There's nothing scientific about evolution. It is dressed up as science, just like heliocentrism. It is an inversion of the Genesis curse, because the Bible tells you that things are doomed to get worse until Christ returns to renew and fix the Genesis curse. Whereas evolution tells you that no, they're actually getting better, and mankind will have this brilliant destiny of ascension and will evolve into gods eventually, because things just tend to get better over time, which is the opposite of the truth. And also, of course, the natural consequence of evolution. Evolution is not, you have to understand this, and this is how you can understand that evolution is a spiritual paradigm and not a scientific one. Evolution is not just about explaining how we got here. Of course, it's wrong, but it's not just about that. Because if you accept that random things just mix together and produced human beings eventually through all these haphazard, chemical reactions, what it also means is that things get better, and therefore we can get better. And looking ahead, what do you have? You have transhumanism, which is the forbidden fruit that you will become like gods. That's what evolution is about. Evolution is about explaining cosmology in such a way that God is not involved. And therefore, if God is not the one governing you, then you can govern yourself. Transhumanism. You have to see the spiritual reality that evolution presents, which of course is the forbidden fruit. The evolutionary paradigm is a filter for everything today, obviously cosmology included, so you need to know why it's impossible. When people mention ages of the earth, or, this rock is 500 bajillion years old, or these fossils are 300,000 million years old, these things are through the lens of evolution. And of course, they're totally mistaken, because dating and carbon dating and fossil, we'll talk about the fossils in just a second, but all these things are misinterpreted, just like you will see redshift in cosmology and the expansion of the universe and all these things. It's all interpreted through a faulty lens. And people aren't questioning their history. They don't bother to investigate science, really, because there's nothing scientific about these things, and they just accept it as authority. And that's how the spell is cast. It is about putting God over here and presenting themselves as the authority, the Antichrist, the Christs in between Christ, the false Christ, the ones who offer you the counterfeit salvation in place of Christ. So what are some problems with evolution, and how do we refute it? Well, it's pretty easy, folks. It really is. You don't have to be an expert chemist or biology major or a scientist to understand why evolution fails. It just simply fails. The first problem is the problem of new information. So here's the reality. When you have something like a wolf, okay, we'll mention this example again. A wolf is very robust genetically, meaning it has a genetic code that has a lot of robust information to deal with all kinds of problems. Eventually, wolves were bred into all kinds of breeds. Today we have wiener dogs and bulldogs and basset hounds and Great Danes and German shepherds and all kinds of dogs. They look a lot different than wolves. Some of them, like German shepherds, look a little more like a wolf, but like a wiener dog is definitely not a wolf, right? So what happened? Well, what happened is that you took that genetic code that has all of this information in it, and you whittled it down over time through selective breeding, because you wanted to pick certain features out, and you're going to mate this one that's a little shorter with that one that's a little shorter, and then you get even a shorter one. And eventually what happens is you have all of these different dog breeds that are very specialized, and they look very different. But what has actually happened in the process, if you look at these individual dog breeds' genetic code compared to a wolf, what has actually happened is information has been lost. Even though they look very different, what happens is the total information has become much less diverse. It's become specialized. The genes of a wolf and the genes of a wiener dog or a basset hound or a poodle are very, very different in the sense that the genetic code, they're still dogs, obviously, but the genetic code is much more robust in a wolf. It can handle a lot more things. That's why you see wolves very healthy. They're huge. They're powerful creatures. I mean, if you've seen a real wolf, they're huge. They're incredibly powerful and robust beings. But today, our dogs, like bulldogs or, again, basset hounds, wiener dogs, they all have problems of some kind. German shepherds, like I had 2 German shepherds growing up as a kid. They had problems with their hips. The first one had epilepsy. The second one died of cancer. I mean, it's horrible. And it's really sad. But it's sad because their genetic code is very specialized. It doesn't have that much protection because the variation, it's like incest, right? Same thing, like if you have today at the end of Genesis curse, if you sleep with your sister and you have a child, that child is very likely going to have a lot of problems genetically because you're mixing 2 things that are not very diverse. This is why thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, when Adam and Eve had children and their children, married amongst themselves, and you saw that even well into Abraham's day and into Israel's day with the various people that were taking wives within their own tribe. It wasn't an issue. It wasn't an issue for Abraham and Sarah to be related. I think she was his half-sister or something like that. It wasn't an issue because the genetic codes were much more robust. It wasn't an issue for Adam and Eve to have children and those children to marry within themselves and to have children and families because the genetic code was much more robust. They weren't specialized. People were much stronger and they didn't have diseases like they have today. Today, we are at the end of all this. Our genetic codes are the weakest that they've ever been in the last, how many thousands of years of history. So the problem of new information is a serious problem because how do you get new genes? How do you get new information in a system where information is only lost over time? The expression changes. You have variety of expression, but internally, you see, this is the illusion they play on your mind. Say, look, it's different. It's evolving. No, it's not. It's not evolving. It's adapting. Sure, if you leave a creature, a type of bird or something on an island, eventually they change, their beaks change. There's a lot of studies of that, but that doesn't mean that they're evolving. They're adapting, meaning they're losing some information. For example, let's say you put a type of bird with just a random experiment here. Let's say you put a type of bird on an island and the bird has short beak, okay? Well, the island, the only way it can get food is if its beak is longer. And so the ones with the short beaks die out. The ones that have a slightly longer beak make it to the next generation. And pretty soon after a couple, maybe 100 years or something like that, depending on how fast they reproduce, you have birds with long beaks now suddenly. Oh, are they evolving? No. The ones that didn't have the genetic information for long beaks have died out. And so it's become more specialized. They've lost information. They lost the short beak information, but maybe that short beak information also came with a slightly better immune system. Everything's related to everything in the genetic code. And so this is the problem that people don't realize, is that information is lost over time as the phenotypical or physical expression becomes more varied, right? So you have a lot more variations and adaptations, but in reality, the genetic code, the genetic diversity is decreasing. So information is being lost. There's no way for evolution to explain how new information is added. They're going to try to make the argument that, well, mutations and genetic variants happen, but no, genetic variants do not create new genes. This is the problem. Yes, genetic variants happen. There's mutations, but they're not creating new genes. They're mutating existing genes. And when you reproduce, certain genes are lost while others are carried over. And so you have the loss of information over time. A genetic mutation is not going to create a vastly different new gene with a new property to it. That has never been observed, ever. But that is the foundational pillar that this theory, which is not really a theory, it's just an occult idea, relies on, that new information can be added via genetic mutation, which is nonsense. Genetic information is lost. So that alone is the killer of evolution. But there's more. There's no transition fossils. There's never been a single transition fossil ever discovered, even though they try to say, well, this is a transition. It's not. There are no transition fossils, folks. They try to peddle these things as transitions, but really all you have is different kinds that are adapting into different ways. Look at the platypus. The platypus, it's cute, and if I get my words right, if there were any transition species ever to be observed, it would be the platypus. It's got the beak of a duck. It's got flippers. It's got a body of a mammal. It's got little claws. It looks like a mole that's aqueous. It's amphibious. I mean, it is a mishmash of things, and yet it has been the same as long as we know platypuses. So the platypus is not a transition fossil. They're a transition being. There are no transition beings. There's never been a transition fossil observed, and there's no transition being observed. Very important that you understand that transition does not mean something adapting. Back to our example with the birds and the beaks. A bird getting a longer beak, adapting to the environment of its area, doesn't mean it's transitioning into another creature. A transition means the idea of evolution is that lizards can become birds, or dogs can become fish, or what. It doesn't matter. Just as long as the mutations are right, it can become anything, which is nonsense. God created kinds of creatures, and those kinds are persistent through history, but they diversify in different kinds. There's the wolf kind, and that wolf kind has a lot of different kinds today, the dog breeds that I just mentioned, but they're all kinds. And so this is the problem, is that there's nothing to explain a transition being. There are no transition beings ever observed, and there's no transition fossils. Of course, the fossil record also disproves evolution if you actually are honest with the evidence. We have seen, for example, that you can recreate synthetic fossils in a lab in 24 hours that look indistinguishable from real fossils. Meaning, the fossilization process, what they tell you, that something dies and it floats to the bottom, or it sinks to the bottom of the ocean, and magically nothing touches it, nothing eats it up, and it just gets sedimentized over, however many millions of years, and it becomes a fossil. This is nonsense. Fossils actually happen over very intense and quick transitions, and we can replicate that in the lab. That is empirical data that proves to you that fossilization can happen in as short of a period as 24 hours. So you do the math. If you have empirical data for one perspective and no empirical data for the other, which one is more likely to be correct? Well, the one with the empirical evidence. The empirical evidence states that we can create fossils overnight. the evolutionary model says, no, all fossils happen, over millions of years or however many long. Well, first off, something doesn't survive that long, especially on the ocean floor, to be a fossil. If anything dies, it gets eaten up in within a few hours by all the critters that are floating around there. Of course, there's also creatures in poses, like giving birth, about to eat something or eating something in all of these fossils, which suggests that these things are found in cataclysmic situations, not, oh, I'm about to eat something and it just freeze for some reason and get fossilized. Like, that's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. There's a lot of fossils like that. There's nothing that survives long enough to be fossilized on the ocean floor. And another piece of evidence is that the fossil record, when you look at the largest fossil deposits, I think one of them is in South America and the other one's in China somewhere, but anywhere really where you see a large fossil deposit, what you tend to see is every creature is together. They try to paint this ridiculous timeline of fossils of, okay, there's this from 2 billion years ago, then a million years later, then this and that, and so on and so forth. That's not the case. When you actually look at the fossil records and you have empirical data, the greatest fossil deposits show that you have trilobites, which supposedly are from, 2 billion years ago, with triceratops, with, various birds of different kinds. Everything is all in one place, which suggests that all these things got killed at the same time. What could have done that? What could have buried them suddenly in water and minerals and basically fossilized them very quickly? What could have done that, I wonder? Well, of course, it was a global or a worldwide flood, a worldwide judgment that the Bible tells you about. And of course, every culture has a story about the flood, which tells you that there is something to it. And the fossil record proves the flood. It proves biblical cosmology, not evolutionary cosmology. Epigenetic adaptation, which is what we were talking about earlier, does not equal evolution. A simple test for that is you take a kind, like a dog, and like a wolf, I should say, really, and you breed it eventually for thousands of years until you get to something like a wiener dog or a poodle. Well, you can never get a wolf back from breeding wiener dogs. You can always take a wolf, which has the robust full genome, and breed all sorts of things from that because you have more information to work with. You can never go back the other way around. If evolution was true, then you should be able to do that. But you can't, because you can't add new information. Mutations do not add new genes. They change existing genes. Another deception is this whole thing with species and genus. Like, what is it? Kings play chess on fine-grained sand. Species, genus, fine-grained sand. Species, genus, family, kingdom, whatever. This whole division of biological beings is nonsense. The Bible doesn't make any such distinction. The Bible just says kinds. There are kinds. And within that kind, there is variety. For example, look at rabbits and kangaroos. They're part of the same kind. Little hoppy things. Of course, kangaroos can probably kill you, and rabbits are super cute. But nevertheless, rabbits and kangaroos are in the same kind. They've diversified. The ones in Australia got huge, or maybe they were huge to begin with. And, the ones in the rest of the world got cute and fluffy. But either way, they're part of the same kind. Wolves and dogs, obviously that's a kind. Cats and lions. I saw a video the other day on Instagram. It was one of these, cute reels, but it's like cats will be cats. And you see a video of like a normal cat doing cat-like things, like, reacting, getting scared and jumping in the air or doing, just doing goofy things. Then you see videos of like lions and tigers and panthers doing the same exact thing in the zoo. And it was supposed to be like, a funny little thing, but the reality is it's true. The reason it's true is because they're all one kind. The size is different, but they're a cat kind and with a lot of variety. A lion, a tiger, a kitty cat, a panther, they're all part of the cat kind. There's no species or genus and family. This is artificial division because they need those artificial divisions to justify evolution. Well, this is a different species that went into that. It's really just a kind, folks. There's the same thing with bears, koalas, grizzly bears, pandas. It's all the bear kind. You have kinds that were taken onto the boat, onto Noah's Ark, and those kinds eventually repopulated the earth and proliferated and created the variety that we see today. Of course, we also have artificial breeding like through what I mentioned with dogs. But the point is that things get worse over time. They adapt, they change, they look different, but that doesn't mean they're getting better. They're getting adapted to their environment, but that doesn't mean they're getting better. Things are getting weaker over time. Look at the giant creatures that existed in the beginning. Some of them even, like I said, in the 1800s, they found the thunderbirds. Huge, monstrous creatures. When God is talking to Job about Behemoth, behold, Behemoth, and his feet are like cedars, and he drinks a whole river. And so the way he's describing it to me just seems like, I think it's very plausible that he's talking about some sort of brontosaurus, or just one of these huge herbivoric, monstrous creatures. And imagine when you look at it, you're like, whoa, like the glory of God just radiates from these things, that God created such a creature. All those things were in the beginning. Trees were much bigger. Everything was much healthier. Probably the air was more oxygenated. There's actually good evidence for that. And the flood changed that. So things got smaller as well. So things are getting worse, folks. Just because they're adapting, yeah, that's the genius of God, because genetics is a very profound piece of engineering. Things adapt and they get smarter at dealing with their situations. But that doesn't mean you're immune from the Genesis curse. It just means that you look different and you're dealing with it as best you can, but nevertheless, you're dying. You're getting worse. There's also the existence of specific features in evolution that evolution can't explain. For example, the bombardier beetle. If you know what that is, it's a little bug that can basically produce explosives with its behind. It has 2 chambers of volatile chemicals, and they mix, it sprays it with its behind, and they mix in the air, and they create like a caustic explosive type of, just fascinating. Fascinating that this kind of stuff just doesn't exist. Or I should say, it doesn't come into existence through evolution. The human eye, the wing, or the ear, all of these sensitive, highly sensitive things and biological mechanisms cannot evolve. It either works or it doesn't. The eye either works or it doesn't. Either you see and you can run away from the predator, or you're blind and you're going to get eaten. There's no such thing as, well, I have 1/10 of an eye and I can see a little bit better than everybody else. Well, no, you're still blind. Do you get it? Same thing with a wing. There's no such thing as, I have 1/10 of a wing and I'm almost flying. Now I have 15% of a wing and I'm getting a little better. No, if you can't fly, you get eaten. You either have a wing or not. The book of Genesis says that God created the birds of the air the same day as, the fish of the sea. So they didn't evolve from one another. The birds of the air came into being. They had their wings already from the beginning, because you need a wing or you don't fly. You're not a bird. So this is the point, that these features that we see, and there's so many of them, are impossible to explain with the evolutionary model, because they're on or off switches. Either they work or they don't. And of course, evolution has no way to explain that. But evolution paved the way for the Big Bang Theory, which was made by a Jesuit in the 1900s. And evolution is needed for heliocentrism, because heliocentrism is an inversion of God's cosmology, of the true cosmology of the Bible. It removes God from creation and therefore can insert man as the God of themselves. Evolution, of course, is also needed for things that came later, like climate change, transhumanism, all the things that we're seeing today. And it all started in the false prophet, the United States, where all the signs and wonders of the final days are coming into existence. Now, some key experiments and figures that you need to be aware of in the 1800s were done because they were destroying the Copernican model of the universe, the heliocentric cosmology. Today, these experiments have been propagandized and they're misinterpreted. There's a lot of propaganda. We'll visit some of them. And of course, this led the need to prop up people like Einstein with special relativity, which we will talk in depth about and refute it. But basically, it was there to confuse everybody. And eventually, George Lemaitre, who basically was the one who created the Big Bang, solidified it through his Big Bang cosmology. Once all the relativism was established by Einstein, then the Big Bang theory came in and basically made the rest, as we say, was history. Of course, they're starting to question the Big Bang a little bit, but they're still operating by Jesuit cosmology. Now, we're going to watch some of the videos that have been done on these experiments with visualizations so you understand them very clearly. You don't have to be a science nerd to understand this. We'll make it sense. We'll make it make sense. But these are some very interesting videos, and we're also going to read the mainstream narrative about them on some of these to show you how they're misinterpreted on purpose, and the narrative is given to you about what happened, when in truth they're hiding actually what happened so that nobody realizes the truth. So the first one is Airy's failure in 1871, and also Francois Arago. Airy's failure, the experiment called Airy's failure, was a test conducted by Astronomical Royal Sir George Biddell Airy in 1871, in which Airy failed to detect the motion of the Earth. The experiment showed that the stars moved. This is from, by the way, wiki.theflatearthsociety.org. Although the Flat Earth Society, I don't know if this is the actual Flat Earth Society that's supposed to be the controlled opposition, but nevertheless, they have the wiki that they have, whoever these people are, is very useful for research on this topic. Anyway, moving on. By first filling a telescope with water to slow down the speed of light inside, then calculating the tilt necessary to get the starlight directly down the tube. Airy unintentionally demonstrated that the Earth was fixed horizontally since the starlight came in at the correct angle without needing to change the tilt of the telescope. We'll see a video demonstration of this in just a second. This is some more commentary on it. Many think it proven long ago that the world orbits the sun. However, the results of the two simple experiments, both performed in the 19th century, showed that it is the stars which move and not the world. This is the Michelson-Morley experiment, which we'll talk about as well. An experiment with a water-filled telescope was performed by the then Astronomer Royal George Airy, after whom the Airy disk of differentiation theory is named, in 1871, which can be considered to be a variation of the earlier investigation by Francois Arago, performed with a moving slab of glass in 1810. So as early as the beginning of the 1800s, people were starting to realize that the Earth isn't moving, and we have experimental proof of it. Arago showed that either the light itself or the luminiferous ether is dragged along by a moving piece of glass. Fresnel explained the effect by assuming it was the light-carrying medium. This is called the Fresnel drag. George Stokes explained it via compression of the ether. But the important point is that whether we can tell which one is doing the moving, the light source or the transparent material. When Arago investigated this effect with starlight, he concluded that the world, with respect to which the glass plate was stationary in this instance, was at rest, and that it was the stars that were moving. The experiment, subsequently performed by Airy, was first proposed by Ruggiero Boscovich for testing James Bradley's heliocentric aberration idea of 1728. Aberration is like distortion. You'll see it'll all make sense in just a second. This, in turn, was thought up to explain the elliptical motion of the star Gamma Draconis, as observed by James Bradley and the Samuel Molyneux over a fairly long period of commencing in 1725. What was the result of Airy's experiment? Exactly the opposite outcome to that predicted in the rotating world scenario. Note that the experiment is usually referred to as Airy's failure for this reason. We'll come back to this. Just like Arago before him, George Airy proved that the world was stationary and that the stars are the ones that are moving. It doesn't matter whether there exists a luminiferous ether or not, because the dragging of starlight, as demonstrated initially by Arago, is real, irrespective of how we try to explain it. Both Arago and Airy showed that it is the stars and not the world which move, although Airy did not actually go so far as admitting this, because you'll find out later that he was under a lot of pressure to frame his discoveries in a certain way. He didn't intend to discover what he discovered, and when he did, they got on him really quick. In addition, we can say that Michelson-Morley, Troughton Noble, and many others have consistently demonstrated no motion of the world around the sun. Francis Arago. In 1810, physicist Francois Arago performed an experiment designed to collect the light of stars near the ecliptic at different times of the year, as the Earth would be moving at different velocities either towards or away from the stars in its orbit around the Sun. On page 9 of The Optics of and Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies from the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, we read about Arago's experiment. Quote, "The problem of refraction in moving bodies became an issue in the wave theory of light because of an experiment performed in 1810 by François Arago. In the context of the particle theory," you'll be seeing quite a bit of this in the future, wave versus particle. He wanted to determine whether light particles entering a prism would be refracted differently depending on their velocity with respect to the prism. To this end, he considered the refraction of light from the same star over the course of a year. Changes in the velocity of the Earth with respect to the star would presumably produce changes in the relative velocity of the Earth and the light particles emitted by the star. Arago observed no such effect on the refraction of the star's light, which means that the Earth wasn't moving as they hypothesized. So when you have a hypothesis and you do an experiment and the empirical evidence proves your hypothesis wrong, doesn't mean that you've necessarily proved absolute proof, but it's evidence that your model might not be correct. And when you have multiple experiments with multiple empirical evidences that agree and have consensus, then your model is not the truth. But of course, we're living in the world of lies, and this is what it is. Now, let's look at, this is a guy named Malcolm Bowden on YouTube. I'm surprised he doesn't have more views, but he's an older gentleman in, I think, England. And he's a geocentrist, which is interesting. He believes, like the Ptolemy, basically, the Ptolemaic cosmology, where the Earth is the center, but the Earth is a ball still. So I don't understand why he believes the Earth is a ball, because curvature is nonsense. But nevertheless, he has some very interesting videos on these old experiments, and he explains them pretty well. So we're going to watch them and get a little better idea of what's going on. This is now Airy's failure. Okay, let's see.
If a telescope is pointing at a star and both are stationary, then obviously the light comes straight into the telescope.
Let's see if we go just a little teeny bit faster. Play speed, how about 1.5? Because he's a teeny bit slow.
In 1729, Bradley found that he had to tip his telescope forward very slightly to get a star in the center of his telescope. It was assumed that this was due to the motion of the Earth around the Sun. Let us assume that the telescope was moving at 5 miles an hour and had to be tipped 5 degrees. This 5-degree tipping, however, could equally be caused by the ether moving at 5 miles an hour, carrying the stars around the Earth. As we see here, the light would be coming in at the same angle, and the telescope would still have to be tipped 5 degrees. So tipping the telescope does not tell us whether it is the starlight moving or the telescope moving. However,
do you see the problem? So the problem is, if you just tip a telescope, you don't know, if that's all the data point that you have, you don't know, is it the heavens that are moving or is it the Earth that is moving? That's the problem that's being solved.
There is a simple experiment that can determine whether it was the Earth that was moving or the ether and starlight. All that you had to do was record the tipping required for any particular star, then fill the telescope with water, which greatly slows down the speed of light in the telescope. So here is the moving telescope filled with water, tipped at 5 degrees, and you can see that the starlight does not now reach the eyepiece at the bottom. This is because the starlight moves much more slowly when passing through water. However, if the telescope is tipped further, say 10 degrees, then the starlight will then be visible again in the eyepiece. It has to be tipped further because the light is now slower when in the telescope.
That's the stellar aberration. So if it's not tipped, but it has a bunch of water in it, the light gets aberrated and it gets distorted. But if it is tipped more with water, then the light reaches the end of the telescope for that star and you can see it again.
But if the starlight is going past the telescope at 5 miles an hour, then when it is filled with water, no further tipping is needed because the light is coming in at 5 degrees anyway. The starlight stays on the same path, but is only travelling slower in the water. To recap, if it is the telescope that is moving, then when it is filled with water, it has to be tipped further to see the star. If the telescope is stationary and the starlight drifting past us, then it does not have to be tipped further.
Because the heavens are the ones that are moving and the light is coming in at an angle. Do you get it? Versus if the Earth is the one that's moving and the light is just coming straight, then yeah, it has to be tipped more in order for there to not be aberration.
1871, George Biddle Airy, the Astronomer Royal, performed this experiment. This is a copy from his original report. You can see that the two readings are virtually identical. If it had been the telescope that was moving, Airy expected a figure of 30 seconds of arc. In fact, he only managed to read 0.8 seconds of arc difference. Bradley first discovered stellar aberration, and it is interesting that in his report, Airy mentions that it was now about 100 seconds of arc, and that it was still slowly diminishing. This indicates that the speed of light was still decreasing in measurable amounts when Airy performed his experiment in 1871. The result of Airy's experiment, known as Airy's failure, was that the telescope does not have to be tipped further. This proved that it was the incoming light that was moving past a stationary telescope fixed to the stationary Earth. What is interesting in his very brief report of only 4 pages is that not once did he refer to the astonishing results that the experiment proved, that the Earth was stationary.
Interesting, isn't it, that he didn't refer to that conclusion? Tells you everything.
This experiment was also dismissed by Wikipedia, which said, "Ether drag test," under the main article, "Luminiferous Ether." By means of a water-filled telescope, Airy, in 1871, looked for a change in stellar aberration through the refracting water due to an ether drag. Like in all other ether drift experiments, he obtained a negative result. This is a gross distortion of the truth. That he did not have to change the angle proved that it was the ether drifting past the stationary surface of the Earth.
Yeah, this experiment is never taught in university. It's true. Nobody hardly ever knows about these experiments. If we go to Wikipedia, let's see what they say about Airy's failure. Oh, where are you? Where are you, Airy's failure? Somewhere in here. Here we go. Ether drag test. Yeah, this is what what Malcolm Bowden read. Like all other negative result, George Biddle Airy did not set out to discover either a stationary or moving ether. Nor did he set out to prove that the Earth itself was either stationary or moving. A simple reading of his paper confirms those facts. Yeah, he didn't set out to prove anything. He discovered it by accident. But then, he was told how to articulate his findings. Airy's experiment was motivated exclusively by what he describes as a discussion in continental publications, to which he refers in the opening paragraph of his paper concerning light undergoing a relative increase in the refraction upon traversing a refracting medium. That is a translational velocity. Blah, blah, blah. Scientific gobbledygook language that basically hides what the meaningful conclusion of this is. A very simple experiment. The fact that you can just fill a telescope with water, which will affect how the light is viewed. If the heavens are moving, then the light, you don't need to tip the telescope. If the telescope is moving because the Earth is rotating like this, then you need to tip the telescope because the light is stationary, right? It's just like curvature with Eratosthenes. We talked about how you either have a flat surface, right? And with a local light source, or you have a curved surface with a giant light source in the heavens. Of course, that doesn't make sense when you actually hold it up to scrutiny, but math is math. Math just shows you relationships. So without having empirical data, you can mathematize anything. You can turn a table into a ball with math and nobody is the wiser. And we have experimental proof of that in that episode. I believe it's episode number 4. So this is the same thing. They're hiding and obfuscating the truth. And of course, they'll never admit that this was empirical proof that the globe is not a globe. It's a flat, motionless plane. However that plane looks in its entirety, who knows? We'll talk about that in a future episode. But the point is that this is empirical proof. And it was actually began in 1810 with François Arago. So conclusion, they call it Airy's failure to discredit this experiment and shape the narrative that, he failed to detect stellar aberration. Well, There's no context for what that means, that he failed to detect stellar aberration. He did fail to detect stellar aberration. But what does that mean? It means that the reason he failed to detect it, distortion, right? Aberration, distortion, when filling the telescope with water versus not having the telescope filled with water, is because the Earth isn't moving. That's why he failed to detect stellar aberration. But you see how they spin it and say, oh, it's a failure, and it makes you think, oh, he failed at something. Yeah, he failed at proving that the Earth is the one that's moving. Of course, again, he wasn't trying to do that, but the empirical results show you that the Earth is not the one moving. Otherwise, there would be distortion, and you'd have to tip the telescope so the light could fit in all the way to the bottom, because the Earth is the one that's moving. It's the heavens that are moving, so the telescope did not need to be tilted. The modern narratives hide this critical point. They also say things like, Airy failed to detect the ether. What do you mean, failed to detect the ether? No, Airy failed to detect the motion of the Earth. They work with assumptive language all the time, meaning they assume something and they make you assume it. And if you don't question, if you don't say, hey, wait a minute, go back to that for a second. Can you say that again? If you aren't sharp like that, then you'll be very easily deceived. It doesn't matter what Airy's intentions were. It's true that he accidentally discovered this and he proved that the Earth isn't moving by accident, but this was a huge problem. This was a very big problem because the Earth has to move in the heliocentric model. Otherwise, you don't have explanation for the sunrise, and everything else. So the Earth being proved that it wasn't moving or rotating at all, and the ether is the one that's carrying the light, whatever the ether is, whether it's just the atmosphere or there's some sort of medium besides the atmosphere. Either way, this is a problem. And it also proves that the photon, which we'll come back to, is a wave, not a particle. But of course, when they got rid of the ether with Einstein, they had to turn the photon into a particle and create all sorts of fancy gaslighting math through the wave-particle duality. And all of this stuff we'll talk about and break down, I promise you. Again, don't feel intimidated if it sounds like it's over your head. We're going to make it as simple as possible. The point is that you realize the gaslighting and the lying that has infiltrated science for hundreds of years. They use relativity and all these techniques that I just described with gaslighting and assumptive language and twisting the truth and mispresenting things and taking these out of context. They use that to this day. And they interpret not only this experiment, but Michelson-Morley, Sagnac's experiment, Troughton, I forget we'll look at it. Was it Troughton? Yeah, Troughton-Noble, Raleigh-Brace. All these experiments we're going to be looking at today is the same thing. They're experiments that have empirical data, and they're twisted immediately by the propaganda machine because you can't have people seeing the truth. It should be called Airy's success because he was successful in proving a stationary Earth. And again, he wasn't out to prove a stationary Earth, but he was successful. He failed at detecting stellar aberration because the Earth isn't moving. That's the parentheses that is missing from Wikipedia, which will never be in Wikipedia because they're controlled. Now, let's look at Michelson-Morley. Very important experiment. Also around this time. Let's see here. Do I have anything? Yeah, I do have something here. Michelson-Morley, this is again from the Flat Earth Society Wiki. The Michelson-Morley experiment was an experiment designed to test the velocity of light that was first performed in 1887 by Albert A. Michelson and Edward W. Morley. Unfortunately, a number of writers on this topic tend to gloss over or sometimes mischaracterize what this experiment demonstrated, its significance, and how it was a turning point in science which necessitated the adoption of a radically different and alternative model of space. This was huge in the history of science, but nobody knows about it. At the time, it was held that in order for light to travel through space, it was necessary that there was a medium filling the void through which it could propagate, much like how sound waves travel through the air or ripples through water. This background medium of space was colloquially known as the ether. Tesla believed in the ether. The goal of the Michelson-Morley experiment was to compare the speed of light in perpendicular horizontal directions at various times of the day, in an attempt to detect the relative motion of matter through the stationary luminiferous ether, by using the Earth's motion around the sun to create interference bands of light for the study. You'll see what this looks like. It's actually a very clever experiment. Morley wrote to his father that the purpose of the experiment was to, quote, see if light travels with the same velocity in all directions. Right, because if the Earth is moving in a particular direction around the sun, and you shoot a light beam in that direction. It's not going to move at the same distance because you're moving against the movement, as opposed to a neutral beam, which is north and south. So if the Earth is moving, you should have different results in your light beams. And of course, they found no difference, which proves that the Earth isn't moving. Just like the Bible tells you. The shocking result of this experiment is that the light did travel with the same velocity in the various horizontal directions tested. The Earth did not measurably move around the sun at all, in contradiction to all expectations and accepted astronomical model. Michelson and Morley found that a light beam discharged horizontally in the direction of the Earth's assumed motion showed virtually no difference in speed from a light beam discharged north or south to north. In other words, the experiment failed to detect the Earth moving in or against space, of whatever space was understood to consist. After now, know the truth now, and remember how they're going to spin it, because we'll see how they spin it and say, oh, it was actually they failed to prove the ether or something like that. It's just crazy how sneaky they are, but of course it's not a surprise. After the famous Michelson-Morley experiment of 1887, one of Albert Einstein's biographers, Ronald Clark, describes what came next. Quote, "The problem which now faced science was considerable, for there seemed to be only three alternatives. The first was that the Earth was standing still, which meant scuttling the whole Copernican theory, and was unthinkable." Michelson and Morley and later scientists repeated the experiment many times, and in many different horizontal axial positions and configurations at different times of the day, all with a null result. The Earth was seen to be motionless. The experiment has been referred to as the moving off point for the theoretical aspects of the second scientific revolution. Now, what was the first scientific revolution? Do you remember? It was a return to the mystery schools. So what was the second scientific revolution? And directly influenced the creation of Albert Einstein's theory of special relativity. That's right. This experiment, which you're about to learn, hopefully you commit it to memory, not that you understand everything about it, but just understand what is dark to light. Of course, this was something that was discovered, and the enemy immediately used it to flip the narrative and create a new thing, which is really just the old thing, which is relativism. The theory of special relativity subsequently found favor among scientific circles because the second postulate of special relativity provided an illusion where the velocity of light is constant to all observers regardless of motion. We'll get back to this when we debunk special relativity, and seemingly explain the motionless Earth result of the Michelson-Morley experiment. Yeah, that's how they answered it, by creating relativism and saying, well, you don't really know what's moving. You can't tell that you're moving, but you're actually moving. It's nonsense. This fundamental change to the nature of space and time allowed the theory of the Earth's motion around the sun to survive a direct contradicting experimental evidence and encouraged, perhaps forced, its adoption as the accepted model of space for heliocentrism. Exactly. Hiding behind relativism made heliocentrism unfalsifiable. If you know what that means, it means basically that it can't be falsified. You can argue that the Earth is moving or the Earth is standing still and the heavens are moving. It's all relative. So if you don't have an objective frame of reference, you can't falsify that the Earth is moving. Of course, we have empirical evidence that the Earth isn't moving. But if you are going to make a relativistic argument, which can be debunked, don't worry, we'll debunk it so that you don't get gaslighted by relativity and people arguing relativity, you will see that this is how heliocentrism hides. It hides behind relativity. And Einstein was the chief proponent. Of course, he wasn't the one who really put it together because he was kind of copying other people like Henry Poincaré. But nevertheless, this is how things have rolled out. G.J. Whitrow, a British mathematician, cosmologist, and science historian, characterized the Michelson-Morley experiment from a historical perspective. Quote, "If such an experiment could have been performed in the 16th or 17th centuries when men were debating the rival merits of the Copernican and Ptolemaic systems, the result would have surely been interpreted as conclusive evidence for the immobility of the Earth, and therefore as a triumphant vindication of the Ptolemaic system and irrefutable falsification of the Copernican hypothesis." But it happened a little bit later, and it was perfectly used by the enemy to create more deception and lies. Now, did I have anything on here? No, I did not. We're going to look at a video now from Malcolm Bowden. I think we're going to look all the way to about, 6 minutes? Let's see. Michelson-Morley, BitChute. Let's look at BitChute first. This is from 30 seconds to about 1:21. Let's see. There we go. I wonder why the sound isn't on. It should be. That's a graphic of the Michelson-Morley experiment. Let's see.
Yeah. I just look at the devil's in the details, and there were valid details in fueling jets. So that's good. All right. So the spin of the Earth, I find the most ridiculous. And this guy who believes in a globe Earth at the center of the universe that doesn't spin.
This is Malcolm Bowden, which we'll watch a video explanation of, but he's commenting on it.
I find that a much more valid opinion than, I don't think it's a ball because of the 8 inches per mile squared, how a lighthouse works. There's a lot of reasons I don't think so, but the spin to me is the most retarded. So I just want to show you the history of why they like how they got the science to make people believe it's spinning, like the entire theory of relativity with Einstein. And that's why they iconicize Einstein so much, is because he's hiding a very, very ridiculous lie. Okay, so check this out. Let me find the gravy. 1 second. Here we go.
Well, if the Earth is moving around the sun, and we shoot that light beam in the direction that the Earth is moving, okay, and then we shoot another light beam perpendicular to that, well, the one that's in the direction of the Earth's movement should be impeded in some way if it's moving through space, whereas this one is going perpendicular would not be impeded.
Why not?
Because it's not going through space. It's just going north and south. Okay. And what they found, they expected to have a 30-kilometer difference between these two light beams. There was no difference. So the natural interpretation, and even Einstein admits this, Mach admits this, Bohr admits this, the natural interpretation is that the Earth isn't moving. So how do we get out of that? Well, you invent special relativity. And now you say, well, the reason that light beam wasn't affected when it went toward the motion of the Earth is because the apparatus shortened. Huh? Yeah. Michelson's apparatus shortened as it was going with the Earth in its orbit around the sun.
Wait, you're telling me that the contraction of mass
Yes.
was invented to explain away the results of the Michelson-Morley experiment?
But they put it into a mathematical formula called the Lorentz transform, and it's probably the most famous equation used in physics today.
Does anyone expressly admit that, hey, we had to come up with this contraction effect because otherwise we're stuck with a motionless?
Yes, the very guy who invented it.
Tell me what
Heinrich
he
Lorentz.
admitted.
Heinrich Lorentz says, I don't have any other explanation to this experiment of Michelson-Morley unless I contract the apparatus. Otherwise, we're going to have to believe the Earth is standing still in space.
And there you go. And the rest, as they say, it is history. This is how relativism gaslights you into a delusion that there's no objective frame of reference. The objective frame of reference is that the Earth isn't moving. And if that's the case, then the natural interpretation when you see the results of this experiment, yeah, the Earth is not moving. But in order to hide that, oh, well, actually the apparatus is contracting because of special relativity. And so that's why there was no change in, or no difference observed in the light beams, which is absolute nonsense because first off, the contraction, the hypothesized effect that they're putting forward through the Lorentz transformations has never been measured. It's all bogus. It's all just theory. But it's not even a theory because it's not based on anything that we observe. It's not based on empirical evidence. It's just conjectures, philosophy, really. And you're going to learn as we go into the 1900s that physicists like Niels Bohr, Albert Einstein, Henry Poincaré, all these people were relativists, they're secret society members, they're occultists, they're philosophers. They're not doing actual science, just like all these other scientists in history who were neck deep in the occult and philosophy and had an agenda behind what they discovered. Of course, they discovered some good things and God uses their efforts for the good, but nevertheless, they were motivated and directed by delusion. So this is the problem, is that this experiment, the Michelson-Morley experiment, proved that the Earth is not moving. And of course, as a result, they had to invent special relativity. They had to invent all these conjectures. Well, actually, the apparatus is, not moving. And what they tell you today about it, how they cleverly hide this, just like with Airy's failures, they say, well, the reason that the light didn't So again, if here's the Earth, pretend my fist is the Earth, right? And it's moving this way, okay? And you shoot a light beam with the movement of, or I should say, it's moving this way, and you shoot a light beam against the movement of the Earth. Well, it's going to be impeded by something. It's going to be impeded by the movement, and the velocity of the Earth is moving is going to affect the velocity of the light beam. Whereas the light beam going up and down is not going to be impeded in any way. So you should expect, if the Earth was moving around the sun, you should expect to see a difference between these two light beams, because one is being impeded by the movement of the Earth because it's being shot parallel to that movement. And the other one is perpendicular. It's not being impeded. It's just going out north. So there is no difference. How do you explain that? Well, what they tell you today is, well, they failed to detect the ether. They failed to detect the ether that because the light beams weren't impeded, because they were trying to detect the ether, and because the light wasn't impeded, that means there was no ether that the light was going through, and relativity is right. We have just photons bouncing around through space. Do you see how clever they are? You really have to be paying attention and be as wise as a serpent. No, the reason the light beams were the same, there was no impediment, was because the Earth isn't moving, not because there's no ether. This is such a clever argument that they do. And of course, like everything else, they just hide it under nonsense and lies. Now, let's see. This is the Michelson-Gale experiment, which was a repetition of the Michelson-Morley experiment, I believe. So let's see if we can listen to this. Playback speed, how about 1.5? And let's see.
In 1925, Michelson and Gale set up an experiment to see if they could detect the rotation of the Earth on its regular 1 revolution per day. They set up a very large rectangle of 12-inch diameter tubes in a field with a light source and mirrors at the corners. The light travelled in opposite directions around the rectangle, and when recombined gave fringe movements, which were only 2.6% different from what they expected would be the result of 1 revolution per day. The very much shorter calibration tube circuit was too small to register any speed difference between the north and south arms. These fringes were used as a basis for the fringe changes when the light went round the full circuit. How did it work? In this diagram...
Now remember, he believes in a ball Earth at the center of the universe, so this part isn't true, but this is the theoretical idea that they're trying to understand, and why Michelson-Morley proves that the Earth isn't moving whatsoever.
I have exaggerated the size of the rectangle of the Michelson-Gale tubes to make it clear how it worked. The equator travels approximately 25,000 miles in 1 day's rotation. You can see that this speed decreases as the latitude increases. At 15 degrees of latitude, the circumference of that latitude is slightly smaller, so it only travels 24,150 miles in each day. The distance travelled per day reduces as the latitude increases, until it is 0 at the North Pole. Imagine their tube...
So really quick, on the ball model, what they say is that the equator moves at a certain rate, and the rotation as you go north or south of that changes, which in and of itself is nonsense. But this is the idea. And so he's enlarging this experiment to give you an idea of how it works, in that the south tube and the north tube have different rates of rotation. If this experiment were like this big on the Earth and the Earth was a ball, then you would have different rotations expected for these various east-west routes. So that's what he's basically pointing out here.
South arm being at the equator and the north arm on the 30 degrees latitude. The light going round the tubes in both directions would experience a higher velocity of the ether going through the south tube at the equator than when travelling through the northern tube at the 30-degree latitude. When they were recombined, they would produce a different fringe interference pattern when compared with the very much shorter path using the calibration circuit. Although their rectangle was far smaller than this, it was sufficient...
Here's the picture, by the way. See, they have these giant tubes. I forget how many, I don't know how long they were, but they were fairly
large to detect the difference with surprising accuracy. From 269 observations, they obtained an average change of 0.230 fringe. This was only 2.6% different to the calculated change expected of 0.236 fringe. Thus, within experimental accuracy, the ether was passing across the face of the Earth at the predicted 1 revolution per day. In their report, there is no mention of any conclusions they draw. They simply state the result. Here, surely we can conclude that there is an ether, and either 1. The Earth is rotating 1 revolution per day, Or 2. The ether is rotating around us 1 revolution per day. That it was item 2 that was correct had already been demonstrated by Airy in 1871. As we have shown in a separate YouTube video given here below, his results showed that it was the ether rotating around the stationary Earth. This was a disastrous result for the establishment scientists, who could not possibly allow any evidence that the Earth was in a special position in the universe to have any scientific support whatsoever. So Airy had to completely fudge his report to say his results merely refuted a proposal by Professor Klingerfues. So here we now have the MG experiment proving that there was an ether and that it was moving across the surface of the Earth 1 rotation per day. How does...
So between Airy's failure, right, which proved that it's not the Earth is moving, but the heavens are moving, and the medium which carries the light is moving, and the Michelson experiments with Morley and Gale and so on, you put the two together and you realize that the Earth is not moving and there is an ether, a medium, just like water propagates information. The air is a medium, is some sort of ether, energy medium that propagates light. So between those two experiments, it was a death blow to the globe. But
present-day establishment scientists deal with the awkward results of the Michelson-Gale experiment. They adopt their usual tactics of lying and obfuscation. I use the phrase relativity gobbledygook. The first thing they do is that whatever the obvious interpretation of the results might be, they immediately boldly claim that they confirm relativity theory. They then proceed to muddy the waters by speaking about inertial frames of reference and entering into complex explanations of how the experiment fully confirms relativity. As an example, I give here the entry in Wikipedia for this experiment, and their confusion is obvious. It is a classic example of pure obfuscation and trying to bypass the most obvious conclusion of the results. Just listen to the weasel words they have to use. It should be noted that Michelson remained a believer in the existence of the ether to the end of his life. A quote from Wikipedia on the Michelson-Gale experiment. As it was already pointed out by Michelson in 1904, a positive result in such experiments contradicts the hypothesis of complete ether drag. On the other hand, the stationary ether concept is in agreement with this result, yet it contradicts, with the exception of Lorentz's ether, the Michelson-Morley experiment. Thus, special relativity is the only theory which explains both experiments. Emphasis MB. Does it really? Here is the bold claim. They do not bother to provide any explanation or evidence whatsoever. The experiment is consistent with relativity for the same reason as all other Sagnac-type experiments. See Sagnac effect.
we'll watch the Sagnac video too. That's an important one.
That is, rotation is absolute in special relativity because there is no inertial frame of reference in which the whole device is at rest during the complete process of rotation. Emphasis MB. This is pure relativity gobbledygook, used to wriggle out of clear evidence. Thus, the light paths of the two rays are different in all of those frames. Consequently, a positive result must occur. It is also possible to define rotating frames in special relativity by the Born coordinates. Yet in those frames, the speed of light is not constant in extended areas anymore. Thus, also, in this view, a positive result must occur. Today, Sagnac-type effects due to Earth's rotation are routinely incorporated into GPS.
Yeah, right. GPS wouldn't function with relativity. So this is what they do, folks. This is what they do. They hide behind relativistic language. They invert the truth. The tactic of the enemy has been the same from the very beginning. It's just lying and weasel words, as Malcolm says it, which is really funny. There's one more video. Oh yeah, ether. This is about the ether. Was this? Yeah. This is like a new agey kind of thing, but look, there is truth in everything, which is very interesting.
And suggest that Max Planck's matrix.
Let's make him not be a chipmunk. How about 1.25?
This matrix is the conduit. Now, the idea that everything is connected is a very old idea. Even in science, in the late 1800s, there was a belief that there was an invisible web of energy that connects everything in the 1800s. And scientists were in a very heated debate, very controversial, as to whether or not this field exists. There was a very famous experiment that was conducted to determine if the field called the ether field actually existed. In the year 1887, the very famous Michelson-Morley experiment was designed to tell once and for all, is the field here or no? Yes or no? The field exists? It does not exist. In my opinion, it was a good experiment. However, it was poorly interpreted. For over 100 years, our science has been based in a belief that is incorrect. It's incorrect. Now, this is very interesting. 100 years later, 1986, the United States Air Force repeated that experiment. 1986, the United States Air Force replicated the Michelson-Morley experiment. They published the results in the very prestigious journal Nature, the scientific journal Nature. What they found was this. They repeated the experiment with good equipment, much better equipment. The bottom line is that the field exists. They found that the field is actually there. This is reported in August 1986, the journal Nature, volume 322. They said, the field is there. And not only is the field there, it measured precisely the way that Michelson and Morley had predicted 100 years earlier. They just didn't have the equipment to work this out. Now, why don't we know about this? This should have made the cover of every major magazine and newspaper. This should have been on CNN headline news or Sky News. But this changes everything for the scientists because the textbooks all say the field is not there. Entire careers are based on the field not being there. And now the field is there.
So the military repeated these experiments. Of course, the snake knows the truth, folks. The snake knows the truth, and they will use the truth to their own advantage as much as they can to try to be like God and try to, do all sorts of nefarious things and hide the truth from you. But the point is that this experiment, the Michelson-Morley and the successive repetitions, Michelson-Gale and so on, was a death blow. It was a death blow to the globe, to the Copernican model, and the enemy panicked quickly. The enemy panicked quickly and responded very quickly with relativism. Henry Poincaré, I think, was in the 1880s, if I'm wrong, maybe 1890s, and then pretty soon, like 20 years after that, you had Einstein come up and started to do his thing. So it was very quickly stuffed under the rug, so to speak, with relativity and relativism. There were multiple experiments done, including the modern one that was cited by the U.S. Navy, I believe. And they all proved the same thing. The Earth isn't moving. Relativity was invented to discredit an absolute frame of rest, which we will talk about in great detail when we have our section on relativity being debunked. But you have to understand that the Earth not moving is an absolute frame of rest. It is a reflection of who God is. God is the rock in Scripture, and everything is made to reveal his nature and character. God does not change. God is the absolute frame of rest, right? You come to me all who are weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest. And also, he's the moral author. He's the creator. He's the unchanging one. He's the self-existent one, the one that's always been and the one that's always will be. So the earth is a physical reminder of that. You're on top of the earth. You're standing on the rock. You build your house on the rock. The earth is not moving. It's durable. It's strong. These are reflections of the creator. And so because the earth is an absolute frame of rest, you have an absolute way of being able to interpret events. Things that are moving in X, Y, and Z direction or doing such and such because you have a frame of rest that can be compared to them. Just like you have God's word, which is the standard, the rock, to interpret all things. And so these things are all, again, to glorify God and to point to God. So relativism was invented for many, many Antichrist purposes, but one of them was to get rid of the absolute frame of rest and make you, the observer, the one that is basically you're like God. You are the frame. You are the objective frame. It doesn't matter if you're moving and a million other people are moving. Everybody's equally true and equally valid as a frame of rest, which is absolute nonsense. If some of this stuff is a little bit over your head, don't worry. We'll make it make sense. Again, Michelson-Morley and all of the experiments they did was just designed to see, does light change in velocity, or the measurements change over distance if it moves in the direction of the Earth's supposed spin versus into the direction of north and south, which is not spinning. And there was no change. The natural conclusion of that, even they admit it to you on TV, is that the Earth isn't moving. But that's untenable for them, of course, and so they created special relativity. Today on Wikipedia, it tells you that, oh, well, they failed to detect the ether. That's why there wasn't any impediment of this ray of light, which is absolute nonsense. There's so much lying through their teeth. And if you don't know any better, you will read these things and you'll believe them. So hopefully now you're getting a little more wise like a serpent. Now, there's a few more. There's in 1901 through 1903, there was the Troughton-Noble experiment. These are all kind of similar. This is in Wikipedia now. The Troughton-Noble experiment was an attempt to detect motion of the Earth through the luminiferous ether and was conducted in 1901 to 1903 by Frederick Thomas Troughton and H.R. Noble. It was based on a suggestion by George Fitzgerald that a charged parallel plate capacitor moving through the ether should orient itself perpendicular to the motion. Like the Michelson-Morley experiment, Troughton and Noble obtained a null result, meaning the Earth isn't moving. No motion relative to the ether could be detected. You see how they spin it for you? Motion relative to the ether. Motion relative to the ether. It's all a relativistic argument. So if you don't understand their schemes of relativism and how they reframe things, then it's like you get overwhelmed by these little linguistic spells. No motion relative to the ether could be detected. No motion was detected because the Earth isn't moving. It's not relative to the ether. The ether is the one that carries the light. And if the ether is the one moving, then the Earth isn't the one moving. That's what you conclude from these experiments. There's so many of them. This null result was reproduced with increasing sensitivity. So they tell you that these things were reproduced and they had the same result, meaning if you interpret them correctly, what does it tell you? It tells you that this model is wrong, and you have empirical proof of it. Such experimental results are now seen consistent with special relativity to reflect the validity of the principle of relativity in the absence of any absolute frame of rest. The experiment is a test of special relativity. Absolute garbage nonsense. Has nothing to do with relativity. Relativity is absolute nonsense, and I will prove that to you today, hopefully, without having to have a physics degree or be, super nerdy with physics. This is Rally and Brace, also around 1904, I believe. Yeah, 1902, 1904. The experiments of Rally and Brace were aimed to show whether length contraction leads to birefringence or not. They were some of the first optical experiments measuring the relative motion of the Earth in the luminiferous ether, which were sufficiently precise to detect magnitudes of second order to VC. The results were negative, which was of great importance for the development of the Lorentz transformation, and consequently the theory of relativity. See, they admit it to you, but without context, you think like, oh, okay, I guess they discovered some new thing in science and they had to label it. No, they discovered the Earth wasn't moving. And so they had to create this fancy mathematical thing, the Lorentz transformation and the theory of relativity, to explain away the result of all of these experiments that were happening, that were very, very embarrassing to the globe. Now, one more. No, we have a few more. This is Sagnac now. Also another very important experiment. The Sagnac experiment was first conducted by French physicist Georges Sagnac in 1913. The experiment is essentially the same experiment as the Michelson-Morley experiment, except that it has a horizontal rotating turntable. The results of the Sagnac experiment show that when the table is rotated around during the experiment, the velocity of the light indeed changes to where c equals plus or minus the velocity, where v is the additional or subtractive velocity of the moving broadcasting device. You'll see a diagram of this and see how it works. This contradicts the Michelson-Morley experiment that was designed to use the supposed movement of the Earth to change position and which showed no change in light velocity. From a paper on the Sagnac effect, one writer states, since its discovery at the beginning of the 20th century, the Sagnac effect has played an important role in the understanding and development of fundamental physics. The Sagnac effect is the dependence of the interference pattern of the rotating interferometer on the direction and the speed of rotation. This phenomenon is universal and manifested for any kind of waves, including the matter waves, and has found a variety of applications for the practical purposes and in the fundamental physics. In the context of the Sagnac effects, the null result of the Michelson-Morley experiment is also not clear. Applying the same logic to sun-centered rotating frame in which the Earth is fixed, one would expect different light speeds as seen from the Earth. All this will make sense in the video in just a second. Critics of the Sagnac effect generally claim that the laws of special relativity do not apply to the Sagnac experiment due to the rotational acceleration of the device. This is what Malcolm was saying earlier. We will say it again, because they're going to argue a relativistic thing, but you can't apply relativity to the Sagnac experiment because there's rotational acceleration. You'll see what that means. However, the same effect is seen in non-accelerating linear motion as well. Let's see, yada, yada. I think that's all I highlighted. So now we're going to watch Malcolm talk about this. And we're going to listen to him at a little bit faster. No, not quality. Quality's fine. Playback speed, let's say 1.25. All right.
In 1913, Sagnac carried out a simple experiment of passing light in opposite directions around a table and recombining them. This produced interference fringes. He then rotated the whole table at 2 revolutions per second and found that the fringes changed. This result has very significant implications in science. It works as follows. A beam of light leaves the light source at the bottom left-hand corner and is split into 2 different beams, which we have coloured red and blue just to distinguish them. They travel round the circuit in opposite directions until they eventually reach the splitter, which also recombines them. There, they then go on to the photographic plate, where they have interference fringes. In this simplified version, we see that the beam is split into 2, the red and the blue again, and they go round the circuit and are recombined at the splitter and recombining prism so that they again produce the fringes on the photographic plate. Now let us rotate the table. Before we do so, there is the very important subject of the effect of the ether. The Michelson-Morley experiment failed to detect the 30 kilometers per second motion of the Earth through the ether. So as to overcome this problem, Einstein simply abolished the ether in his relativity theory. The very significant result of the Sagnac experiment was that it proved that the ether existed. Let us see how it did this. It is a fundamental feature of relativity that it claims that as there is no ether, light travels away from a source at the same speed relative to the source, whether the source is moving or not. Thus, whether the table is turning or not, the fringe patterns should stay the same.
Because special relativity got rid of the ether, which is the medium for light to travel through, and inverted everything. It turned something to nothing. Ether is something. It's a medium. Light behaves as a wave. Einstein turned it into empty space and made light into a particle. You understand why all these things, these are very relevant to the cosmological model of heliocentrism. But they're inversions. They're not true. And because there's empty space, there's no medium. Therefore, if something is moving like a projector and it fires off a light beam, then it should be moving at the same velocity. It should be no effect. If there's a medium and a projector moves, like in this little demonstration, then the ether will affect the movement of the light beam.
But if the ether exists, once the light has left the source, the speed of the light is controlled by the ether, independent of the speed of the table, mirrors, etc., as we see here.
Just like if you had a good example of this is like, I mean, it's not a perfect example, but let's say you had, let's say you take a bow and arrow. You take a bow and arrow. Again, it's not a perfect example, but it kind of illustrates the point. You take a bow and arrow and you shoot an arrow in the air, right? It goes pretty far, depending on how you shoot it. If you take that bow and arrow and you go into the water and you shoot it, the water, the medium, is the determiner of the velocity of that arrow, right? That makes sense. The water is very viscous. It's much thicker than the air. The arrow is not going to get very far. You'll release it and it'll probably just, float. So this is the difference. If there's empty space, then the velocity of the light should not be affected. If there's ether, then the velocity of the light should be affected if you start rotating the table, right? Because if it's stationary, if the table's stationary and you do this recombinant thing, versus if it's moving and there's a different result, then there's an ether. If there's no different result, as you will see, then space, there's just empty space. So let's find out.
So let us see what happens when we rotate the table. Here, the light is split, and the red and blue lights go in opposite directions. But notice that the left-hand mirror has moved around in such a direction that the distance the red light has to travel is further. Now in relativity, the same time should be taken because the splitter is also moving and the distance between them is the same. But now imagine that the ether exists and the speed of the light is controlled by the stationary ether. Imagine the ether like a thick treacle that limits how fast the light can travel, independent of the motion of the light source, the splitter, or the mirrors. The result is that the red light takes longer to reach the left-hand mirror. Similarly, the right-hand mirror is coming towards the blue light, so it reaches the mirror quicker. After they change ends, the red light again takes longer to reach the recombiner, whilst the blue light gets there quicker again. So they reach the photographic plate with a delay between them, and this changes the fringe pattern. In fact, Sagnac, using the speed of the rotation of the table, calculated how much the fringes should change, and found that they did change by just that amount. The crucial feature of this experiment is that it demonstrates that the ether does exist, which demolishes relativity. How does the scientific establishment deal with this result? By muddying the waters with scientific gobbledygook.
Gotta love that gobbledygook.
Wikipedia says, in the above discussion, the rotation mentioned is a rotation with respect to an inertial reference frame. Since this experiment does not involve a relativistic velocity, the same wording is valid both in the context of classical electrodynamics and special relativity. How on earth can it be valid in both theories? It clearly proves that the ether exists because the speed of the light is controlled by the ether, independent of the rotating table and mirrors. This Sagnac effect is used by airlines for their compass directions. As the plane turns, the change in the fringes are translated into a change in the direction of the plane that then registers on the cockpit compass. In addition, I have received comments from 2 scientists complaining that they were never taught about the Sagnac experiment. The first said, "After 35 years as a professional physicist with a thesis in relativity, I only learned of Sagnac's experiment last year." Another correspondent complained that his professors never mentioned these important experiments. Dear Mr. Bowden, thank you for your enjoyable and well-written website. I've enjoyed visiting there today. I was especially interested in your comments on geocentricity, which, as noted, are controversial. The amazing thing is that none of the experiments cited were ever discussed in my undergraduate education, nor the implications cited. All my life I have heard the story of how Copernicus's theory came to prevail. I would have thought that major experimental evidence, already in existence, and calling the theory into question, would have at least been cited. One feels cheated as a student, of course, to keep finding 25 years later these bodies of contrarian evidence that never are mentioned in the classroom unless a student has already researched the topics and brings them up. Yet again, we have the suppression of scientific evidence that supports creation and geocentricity.
Boy, so much has been lied to with all of these various experiments, and it's sad, but most people don't know it. I have a good friend who's got a degree in like theoretical physics or something in physics, and I argue with him all the time about this, but he's so indoctrinated, unfortunately, and it is what it is. It's the bias of expertise. That's why I said it's probably better. It's better that you aren't a physics nerd, because most of the things that you've been taught about physics in terms of relativity are wrong. And hopefully you'll learn that today, and you'll be able to undo that programming, and you'll be able to help other people to wake up as well. They use very clever language and say, you see, Sagnac's experiment is contradictory to Michelson-Morley, because Michelson-Morley proved that there's no movement in the ether, and then Sagnak's experiment proved that there is movement with rotation. So the only way you can experiment was, or the only way you can explain it is with special relativity. No, it's very simple, folks. The 1800s proved that the Earth isn't moving, and it's the ether that carries the light that moves. Sagnak's experiment in 1913 confirmed that. And they tried to explain it with such confusing and gaslighting concepts like relativity, so that you don't have any idea of what's actually going on. But it's very simple. Again, bow and arrow, if you shoot it in the air versus shooting in the water, it's expected that the water is going to be a very different result, right? Because you're changing the medium by which that thing is moving through. If the ether exists as a medium, then when you apply velocity to the projector of light, you're going to have a different interference pattern, because one of them, especially in this case, it's a table, is rotating towards the projector. The other one's rotating away. And so you're going to have a different distance that the various lights, the red light in this case had to travel farther than the blue light, because the reflector is traveling towards, and this one is traveling away, like we saw in that little graph. And if there's a medium, then the medium affects how much it travels. So one is now going to be longer than the other. That makes sense. It's very simple. But of course, if you have been brainwashed by relativity and all these things, and we all have to some degree, then they get into your head. There's been many experiments after Michelson-Morley that prove that the Earth was stationary, including up until all the ones we discovered. And the way they hide these things is by saying, oh, they obtained a null result. And giving you no context. What does that mean that they obtained a null result? Yeah, they obtained a null result that the Earth wasn't moving. That's what they obtained. A null result of no spin around the axis. And of course, that means that the ether is the medium that's carrying the light, just like most people, including Tesla, believed. If the Earth was moving through a vacuum at thousands of miles per hour and tens of thousands of miles per hour and doing all these ridiculous motions, then light with the Michelson-Morley experiment should have been different if it's fired with the Earth's rotation versus perpendicular. But it wasn't. And that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt from their own mouth, as you saw in that interview, that the Earth isn't moving. And they had to panic and create some sort of conjecture to basically fool and deceive people into continuing this model and making it unfalsifiable with relativism. Now, I want to talk about Auguste Piccard, who also was a very important figure, although again, he wasn't trying to prove anything, but he is an important figure for some of the things that he did, because this was before the age of space exploration where everything was controlled by the false prophet. This is on Wikipedia. Auguste Antoine Piccard was a Swiss physicist, and if I can get this stupid little thing out, an explorer known for his record-breaking hydrogen balloon flights, with which he studied helium. I'm thinking of NASA being the largest consumer of helium, but we'll get to that later. In which he studied the Earth's upper atmosphere and became the first person to enter the stratosphere. Piccard was known for his invention of the first bathyscaphe, with which he made a number of unmanned dives in 1948 to explore the ocean's depths. Piccard's twin brother, John Felix Piccard, is also a notable figure in the annals of science and exploration, as a number of their relatives, including Jacques Piccard, Bertrand Piccard, Jeanette Piccard, and Don Piccard. So he's an interesting fellow. On May 27, 1931, Auguste Piccard and Paul Kipfer took off from Augsburg, Germany in a hydrogen balloon and reached a record altitude of about 10 miles. During this flight, they became the first human beings to enter the stratosphere and were able to gather substantial data on the upper atmosphere as well as measure cosmic rays. Now, what they won't tell you, which will have to go to another source for that, is that what he observed is a flat plane. And of course, he believed in heliocentrism from what I remember. He wasn't like a flat earther or anything, but he was again discovering something that nobody expected him to discover. So very quickly, these things are hidden. This is from flatearthsociety.org. It's a forum, but it's an interesting post from somebody. He says, in my understandings, Piccard believed in the heliocentric model. His work with the Fonds National de Recherche Scientifique was to validate theories proposed about cosmic rays from outer space and their effects on our planet. With him inventing technology used in underwater travel to account for the pressure difference, he modified his work to create a vehicle that could account for atmospheric pressure. The idea to get into the stratosphere via balloon and run experimentations that, in theory, should provide hard evidence to the existence of cosmic rays. So that was his intention. The man ascended to a record-breaking 10 miles, later breaking this record many times over in a total of 27 balloon flights and a final record of 23 miles in height, which is pretty crazy. This was before exploring the sky was strictly militarized. Very important. Many of the people seen in the footage of Picard's takeoff are volunteers, local firefighters, townspeople, and visitors who came to watch the balloon's ascension. This was not controlled to a need-to-know basis. We can take the man's observations as fact, as the integrity of the man is not compromised. Yeah, I don't think he was a secret society member. He was just one of these, explorer-type people, and again, discovered things that probably weren't meant to be discovered because, again, the space, I shouldn't say space, I don't believe in space, there's no such thing as space, but the space above, let's put it, the atmosphere above wasn't militarized during his time. So it's very interesting. He is not affiliated with any government, and so we know his work was not reviewed for national security purposes prior to publication. The man was a researcher. Holding back any observation would not have been in his interest, even if they were counterintuitive with his preconceptions. As holding back any observation, even one that is not understood, would only become a hindrance in his work and to further studies of his work. An article from the magazine Popular Science, August 1931, published by Bonnier Corporation, explored the first set of 10 miles high. Keep in mind, today's average airlines never see this height. The article reports, paraphrased, through use of oxygen tanks, they, both Auguste Piccard and Charles Kipfer, were able to execute their tests. For they reported air pressure at such heights to be so low, 1/10 than sea level. They did find the cosmic rays they set out to prove does in fact appear more intense in the stratosphere compared to being on the ground. Yeah, and who knows what these things are, folks? Who knows what these things are? We don't know. We don't know what the firmament is. We don't know what the ether is. All the energies that are floating through the earth. I mean, it's a profound mystery. There's something going on, but who knows what they are. This article then goes to report that at such a height, the air appeared blue, which is also interesting, and that they were able to capture this blue air in cylinders to experiment with. The article describes this gas as intensely blue and ozone, O3, rich, and references it as radio-proof, as if radio signals bounce off of this layer. This is a later excerpt from the article. Quote, "Through portholes, the observer saw the Earth through a copper-colored, then bluish haze. It seemed a flat disk with an upturned edge. Then at the 10-mile level, the sky appeared a deep, dark blue. Above are facts I have found in my own research. Below is my personal opinions based on those facts and is not intended to be taken as anything more than that. Picard's research is important because I feel it may bring light to other matters. On a globe, when you see the stars circle clockwise in the northern hemisphere and counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere, you would conclude the Earth is spinning eastward. On a flat Earth, however, when you see the very same opposite motions of the stars, you come to the conclusion that the stars are acting as one big Tesla coil, energy taking the path of the geometric torus, which we've talked about. You live in a torus, a toroidal field of some kind, to sustain and generate free energy. I am a flat earther, and I do believe that the stars are one big energy generator. I'm also a Bible literalist. I believe the Bible to be literally true. I believe on day one, God said, 'Let there be light.' References both this free energy system being established and the gases that make up our air being created. The atmosphere is made of oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and argon. Now, the reason I believe that argon and free energy is the light created on day one is because argon is a noble gas, and so it conducts electricity. When electricity is put through argon gas, it creates a blue photon that is unmistakably sky blue. This is how neon lights work. Since we already know argon can create blue light when given energy, and since we know the sky has both argon and energy, like the cosmic rays, which again, we don't know how these things are coming from because they're interpreting it from the heliocentric model, but the heliocentric model is not true. So where's it coming from? It's coming from somewhere. We know why the sky is giving off blue light. Yes, the sky is giving off light. I believe when Dr. Auguste Piccard captured blue air, he found hard evidence that the sky produces light without the sun, just like the 7 days of Genesis will tell you. Yeah, the sun was created on day 4. which means there was light for a couple days. How did that light exist? There must be something independent of the sun, which is fascinating to think about. Maybe some sort of energetical system, electromagnetic system that is producing energy, which is probably what Tesla knew about and some of these other people. But anyway, the second day, let there be a firmament separating the waters from above the waters below. I believe the waters above is the deep dark blue that Picard noted the sky to be at 10 miles high. Hennessy Liquor did an ad campaign celebrating Dr. Auguste Picard's accomplishments. This ad depicted the ascension Picard took. Interestingly enough, the makers of the ad decided to show the ascension ending in Picard breaking through the firmament into waters above, just like the 7 days of Genesis would tell you. Nobody's breaking through the firmament, that's for sure. On the third day, until Jesus returns, he's going to open the firmament and come down. But on the third day, the creation of plant life. It is important to note that the sun has not yet been created, and thus the photosynthesis process does not fit with the biblical worldview. This is also a problem, unless there is something independent. This goes back to my theory that the free energy created by the Tesla coil and the argon in our air creates daylight and not the sun, just like the 7 days of Genesis would tell you. In the fourth day, God created the sun and the moon. The Bible does not reference stars in the 7 days unless you agree with my theory that the first day's light used the stars of the Tesla coil as a catalyst to create light. Finally, here is my question. Does what I am saying seem reasonable? Can we see the experiments that Auguste Picard did to confirm the 7 days of Genesis are scientific and accurate explanations of the creation of the earth? And is it all possible that the cosmo rays theorized by Einstein that Picard confirmed is evidence of the Tesla coil free energy that our stars create? Yeah, for sure. We've talked about this in the previous episode, I think episode number 1 in this series, where we looked at star in a jar, sonoluminescent phenomenon, where you have sound in water and it produces energy because of the cavitation. I mean, that is empirical proof that the biblical worldview is plausible, right? We know the Bible is true, but we have empirical evidence that you can create a star in a jar using water and sound, versus the heliocentric model, which has no basis in reality, no empirical evidence that stars can ever be created the way they're saying, because there's no evidence of gravity. There's no way, nobody's ever observed a star being formed over cajillions of years. It's nonsense. It is nonsense. So you have empirical evidence, and of course, there are these things like cosmic rays. There's a lot of things that we don't understand, and they are part of this energetic system. And the occult has always tried to study the system to harness it for itself and try to be like God and so on. This is from, this is now the Apologetics by the Globers. This is the flatearth.ws on Auguste Picard. Notice the snaky language. In 1931, Auguste Picard went up in a balloon at an altitude of 10 miles, not far above the cruising altitude of an airliner. At the altitude, Earth's curvature is still very slight and difficult to see, especially through the small portholes in his chamber. In a Popular Science interview, Picard was reported to have said that the Earth seemed like a flat disk with an upturned edge. The flat earthers quickly interpret his statement as if he was telling us Earth is flat. In reality, in another interview, it is clear that he is convinced the Earth is a sphere. In his writings about his expeditions, the word globe was also mentioned several times. Yeah, he was a heliocentric believer, but it doesn't change the fact that what he described was a flat horizon. Now, that is not possible if the Earth is any kind of ball, because the horizon does not rise to meet your eye level. And you have proof from somebody who doesn't seem to have any associations that he just observed it before the sky was militarized. At 10 miles high, you have the horizon rising to meet your eye level, which proves to you that you're not on a ball, folks. It really does. It's such a simple proof. Picard reached the altitude of 10 miles before the PopSci interview, not that far above the altitude of a commercial passenger flight today. See, they got to diminish everything. Earth's curvature is still not easy to ascertain from that altitude. It's not too easy, or it's not too hard. You just look for yourself and you see that it's straight. We have dog cam footage from 100,000 feet up in the air that's still flat as a board. In the interview with RTS Radio, he said he did not notice Earth's curvature from the small porthole of his chamber, but was convinced that it would be possible to see the curvature if he were using a ruler. In his balloon flight, he was inside the chamber the entire time. He can only see the outside from several portholes, 8 centimeters, 3 inches in diameter. There you go. See, he just couldn't see it well. he wrote in his experiences, his book, Earth, Sky, and Sea, he never once mentioned flat Earth. On the contrary, the word globe was mentioned many times. His grandson claimed on his website that Auguste Piccard was the first man to witness the curvature of the Earth. So, of course, you have propaganda, folks. You have propaganda, and the propaganda is very, very detailed, and they try to weasel their way through all of these different scenarios and change the frame of interpretation. That's what this is all about. It's always about something happened, here's the truth, and then quick, let's get on top of it and tell you a different story. This is the story of the ages, where you have the truth and then you have the counterfeit, always coming in front between you and the truth. Auguste Piccard was the first person to go extremely high altitude, 10 miles at first and then eventually up to 23. At 50,000 feet, he did not observe the curvature of the Earth. The twisted and backwards way that they apologize this by saying, no, he believed in a globe, look at these other planets. Yeah, he was a heliocentrist, but he documented his observation that it seemed to him like a flat disk. Now, that doesn't mean the Earth is a circle. The Earth has the circle of the Earth, which is important, but it doesn't mean the Earth is a circle, which is also an important thing. But we have footage, again, from 100,000 feet in the air. You can look it up on Google, on YouTube, dog cam. 100,000 feet, flat as a board, and as far as the eye can tell. That is not possible if the Earth is a ball. The argument that, well, you just can't see the curvature that high. You got to keep going higher. Eventually you'll see it. No. If the Earth was curved of any kind, the moment you would rise above sea level, or the horizon that you're at, the horizon would fall under your eyes. It does not rise to meet your eye level. The reason it rises to meet your eye level is because it's an infinite plane. It's flat. It doesn't curve. It's flat, so as you rise, it just keeps changing and matching your vanishing point, your eye level. If it was curved, that's not possible. It is impossible, physically impossible. And this is what you need to know. You don't, again, need to be super into physics or, super nerdy with that. You just need to know simple things. The reason you can climb on a mountain and see the horizon just like you can when you're at the bottom is because the Earth is flat, and the horizon rising is proof of that. Piccard also observed some interesting properties of the high atmosphere, like with the argon and stuff, which, again, I don't have an opinion either way, like how that guy had some theories. I think they're very interesting. I think they're plausible for sure. But there's definitely an electromagnetic chemical battery that we live in. The Earth is a clock. The Earth is a machine. It's a very complex, beautiful, amazing machine that reveals God's glory. It's very well precisely made, like a clock. The heavens, the sun, the moon, and the stars are a precise clock. There's a free energy system that continues everything. I mean, it's really, truly profound. And of course, we can speculate on that system. And some of those speculations are very interesting, like how he was talking about the sky being some sort of electromagnetic phenomenon where it generates energy and light, independent of the sun. And maybe the sun, once the sun came around, it creates kind of like a dualism with the sky or something, some sort of partnership. But who knows? I mean, who really knows? We don't have any good evidence on these things. I mean, we have some good evidence, but my point is we don't have that much research because we don't have the budget. NASA has all the money. The snake has all the money. And so we have to go on things that we see from older times in history when things were not as regulated. And we know the Bible is true. So we use that as a lens. We have our senses, and we have technology to where we can now make observations, right? There's that 600-mile observation from Israel to Crete, I think we documented in the first episode. That wasn't possible, 100 years ago. Now we have technology that can prove that the Earth is definitely flat. Of course, that's been proven already. But anyway, this is now one more with the Coriolis effect. Of course, people who believe in a globe always bring up the Coriolis effect, and it's just another smoke and mirror scam. So we're going to watch a short video on the Coriolis effect and how it's just bogus like everything else.
In the mid-19th century, a Frenchman named Gaspard Gustave Coriolis performed several experiments showing the effect of kinetic energy on rotating systems, which have ever since become mythologized as proof of the heliocentric theory of the cosmos. The Coriolis effect is often said to cause sinks and toilet bowls in the northern hemisphere to drain spinning in one direction, while in the southern hemisphere causing them to spin the opposite way, thus providing proof of the spinning ball Earth. Once again, however, just like Foucault pendulums spinning either which way, sinks and toilets in the northern and southern hemispheres do not consistently spin in any one direction. Sinks and toilets in the very same household are often found to spin opposite directions, depending entirely upon the shape of the basin and the angle of the water's entry, not the supposed rotation of the earth. From science.howstuffworks.com, quote, while the premise makes sense, that the Earth's eastward spin would cause the water in a toilet bowl to spin as well, in reality, the force and speed at which the water enters and leaves the receptacle is much too great to be influenced by something as minuscule as a single 360-degree turn over the span of a day. When all is said and done, the Coriolis effect plays no larger role in toilet flushes than it does in the revolution of CDs in your stereo. The things that really determine the direction in which water leaves your toilet or sink are the shape of the bowl and the angle at which the liquid initially enters that bowl. So even mainstream science publications admit the so-called Coriolis effect has absolutely no effect on the behavior of water in sinks and toilet bowls. But this fact doesn't deter scammer opportunists in Ecuador and other tourist traps along the equator, where a popular parlor trick...
Watch this. This is a parlor trick stuff, but they're going to move the table across the supposed equator or something, and now suddenly the water flows differently. I mean, come on.
...is performed using a portable sink to purportedly prove this Coriolis effect. First, the showman sets their sink, already filled with water, perfectly along the equator line, then pulls the drainage plug, showing their audience how the water drains straight down the hole. Next, they pick up their portable sink and walk their gullible audience several meters to the south, into the southern hemisphere.
See, in Romania, we had gypsies, and gypsies were always doing this kind of stuff, so we're very skeptical of these kind of parlor tricks.
Explaining how the Coriolis effect will now cause the water to spin clockwise down the drain. This time, they purposely pour water into the sink from the left-hand side, and quickly pull the drain plug while the water is still spinning clockwise from the angle it was poured. Next, they pick the sink up again and move the magic show a few meters into the northern hemisphere, explaining how the water will now spin counterclockwise. To conclude the show, they then pour water into the sink from the right-hand side, making sure to quickly pull the plug while the water is still spinning counterclockwise. The Coriolis effect is also said to affect bullet trajectories and weather patterns as well, supposedly causing most storms in the northern hemisphere to rotate counterclockwise, and most storms in the southern hemisphere to rotate clockwise, to cause bullets from long-range guns to tend towards the right of the target in the northern hemisphere, and to the left in the southern hemisphere. Again, however, the same problems remain. Not every bullet, and not every storm, consistently displays this behavior, and therefore cannot reasonably be used as proof of anything. Many professional snipers have stated unequivocally that they never have to factor or compensate for this supposed Coriolis effect. Sniper bullets are actually affected by wind, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, sight aperture, and human error, not the alleged spin of the Earth. From snipershide.com, quote, I've shot at 2,000 meters, and whoever says Coriolis effect is a factor is full of it. Wind, and more crosswinds will play games with your bullet more than anything else. And from sniperforums.com, quote, I shoot at distances up to 3,000 yards, yet I have never experienced a need to compute for Coriolis effect. I have killed deer out to 1,000 yards and never had something go awry that could be attributed to Coriolis. Ironically, the same people who claim sniper bullets are affected by the Earth's spin are the same people who claim planes, helicopters, and hot air balloons are not affected by the Earth's spin, because the entire atmosphere is somehow magically adhered to the Earth and dragged spinning perfectly along with it. These globe Earth apologists cannot have it both ways. Either the atmosphere is independent of the Earth's alleged rotation and can affect bullet trajectories, or the Earth and the atmosphere move perfectly together and therefore can have no effect on bullet trajectories whatsoever. If they claim the former, and the atmosphere is independent of Earth's alleged rotation, then helicopters should be able to simply hover in place and in 12 hours be halfway around the world. Or if they claim the latter, that the Earth and atmosphere do move together, then they are admitting that the so-called Coriolis effect is non-existent and could have no effect on bullets or weather patterns.
So do you see the problem with Coriolis? By the way, Gaspard Gustave Coriolis was in the 1800s. That's why I highlighted this, because that was also another thing that was being developed to justify, the Earth's spin and storms and all these things that were basically coming together for the 1900s shenanigans that we're about to cover next. But anyway, Coriolis effect is something that people bring up quite a bit, and you need to understand why it's nonsense. It doesn't exist. The notion that Coriolis effect affects the direction of the water going down a drain is nonsense. what affects the water going down the drain is the direction of entry and the shape of the basin and so on. As you can clearly tell, these are parlor tricks. I mean, the fact that they're changing, people believe this stuff though. Here's on the equator. Now let's move a couple feet later. See, suddenly the Earth's spin is affecting it differently. I mean, how gullible can you get, really? But of course, people don't study this kind of stuff, and they're easily fooled. These are signs and wonders by gypsies and false prophets and so on. But Coriolis effect is a real problem for the Globers because either the atmosphere moves over the Earth, as they're saying, and is creating all of these Coriolis realities, or the atmosphere moves with the Earth. Here's the problem. If the atmosphere moves over the Earth, then the Earth is moving independent of the atmosphere. That means that you could take a helicopter and hover over the Earth, and the Earth could just rotate under you, and you could just hover there for however many hours and land somewhere else on the Earth. Of course, that doesn't happen because the Earth isn't moving, but this is the issue. And of course, globe people say, well, no, you can't do that because you're moving with the Earth. Well, if you're moving with the Earth, then the atmosphere does not move independent of the Earth, and there's no Coriolis effect. You can't argue Coriolis, because if you do, then you have to accept that helicopters and planes could just literally stand still and land in their position and wait for the Earth to move under them if the atmosphere and the Earth were moving independent of one another. But that's not what happens. And so ultimately, there's no Coriolis. There's no such thing as Coriolis. No sniper ever is going to say, oh, I accounted for Coriolis effect. No, there's wind and there's atmospheric conditions, but there's no such thing as the Coriolis effect. It doesn't happen. And of course, the explanation they give is that gravity pulls the helicopter with you, with the Earth, through the atmosphere, and you aren't realizing that you're moving, even though you're moving at 1,000 miles per hour, supposedly. I mean, it's just gaslighting nonsense. You're supposedly moving at 1,000 miles an hour because an invisible force that's never been proven is carrying you with the Earth through the atmosphere, and the atmosphere is moving independently as well, but you're not aware of any of these movements, and they're just kind of happening, even though to you, if you were hovering over the ground with a helicopter, you're hovering over the ground. The ground is not moving. You're not moving either. You're just hovering over it. You see how much gaslighting this is? And of course, we'll get more and more into it as we get into the next section. But the Coriolis effect is nonsense. So it's funny because they say that the ether doesn't exist, but then they argue that the atmosphere moves across the surface of the Earth to create Coriolis, which is practically the same idea, that there's this medium that moves independent of the Earth, and it's doing these various things, and they're arguing it in their own model. And if they're going to argue that, then it refutes their model, which is just, it's so much confusion. I hope by now that you're starting to see, maybe even if some of the math and science stuff is over your head, and that's okay. My goal is to document it for also people who are math and science inclined, and they need maybe a little extra documentation to take the step forward. Either way, doesn't matter if you're into science and math a lot or you're a total math nerd. The point is to see how confusing and just absolutely self-contradictory this whole heliocentric conspiracy is. It's an occult idea mishmashed together with poor math, poor science, lies, propaganda, and just nothing but illusions. So, summary for the 1800s. The 1800s was a period of time of huge satanic activity right after the French Revolution. You had Enlightenment, humanism, you had the Jesuits taking over America, and Protestantism. Remember, all this stuff was happening at the same time they were rewriting the end times theologies too, as well, with Darby and Schofield and so on, as well as the Pentecostal movement with Irving. All the so much stuff was happening in the 1800s. It's really, truly crazy how they were able to coordinate all this, which again tells you that they're following the devil and being guided by the devil. They're not doing this just by themselves because they wouldn't be so well organized. There are secret societies, Lunar Society, Cosmo Club, the Freemasons, Rosicrucians, Skull and Bones, blah, 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 so on and so forth, universities, all of these things, the Smithsonian, they were coming up to take over education and to control the dissemination of information. You had things like evolution, atheism, communism was born, Zionism was born in the 1800s, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, the occult, theosophy, the World Parliament of Religions, and the ecumenical movement started to actually build in the late 1800s. So there's a lot of stuff that happened that was very satanic, very dark, very evil. lots of false light, false prophets that were all over the place. Now the question is, are we to think that science, in all of this satanic activity, that science somehow was immune from the devil's schemes? Well, hopefully you've seen that science hasn't been immune from the devil's schemes for many centuries, from a very long time ago, because science and spirituality were always tied together. So the idea that science is this objective beacon of truth is absolute nonsense, my friends. The 1800s was a period of significant developments in cosmology and science as a whole. But when I say science here, in quotation marks, I mean the narrative. I mean the matrix that you're in, that you need to get out of. The occult forces solidified, and they created a foundation for future things like NASA through the Cosmos Club. And of course, several powerful experiments were done during that time that threatened the Jesuit cosmology. These experiments were very quickly explained away, and Einstein was propped up with relativity and relativism and causing confusion and all sorts of gaslighting, which we will get into very in-depth in a future section. Other experiments like Coriolis and Einstein's experiments were very quickly propped up to convince the masses of the new model with the relativity and, oh, look, there's Coriolis and this is what's happening. And, oh, I guess that's how it works. And you'll see with the rise of Hollywood and Universal Pictures and all of these things, it started to immediately cover up the truth with propaganda, with learning against learning, and taking the false signs and wonders to the next level, which is what we have today. The age of deception, really. People like Auguste Piccard were the first to very high altitudes, and they described very honestly, even though he didn't believe in a flat Earth, he's like, okay, this is flat. That's what it seems like to me, which tells you that before the sky was militarized, somebody with no agenda saw a flat horizon. Is that proven, or I should say confirmed, by modern technology? Yes, it is. Because the dog cam, which went 100,000 feet, not just 50,000 feet, went 100,000 feet in the air, saw the same thing, a flat horizon. Look it up on YouTube. And it's very well documented. A flat, completely flat horizon, uninterrupted camera footage from launch all the way to the top, which NASA will never give to you. They're always going to do clever little angle tricks to basically get into their CGI model. But anyway, these things all set the stage for major, major developments in the 1900s until modern day, to basically solidify the delusion of heliocentrism and to move into the final phase, which is the ecumenical world marveling after the beast phase of heliocentrism. The false prophet had major work to do in the 1900s, and the 1800s set the stage. So now onwards to even more delusion, the 1900s to the modern day.